Chapter 1130. No one dared to leave the martial emperor city anymore. Su Fengnian did not push his luck. He bent his fingers several times and guided several weapons into the air. For example, the elm podsword was nailed into the ground a few feet in front of the ink-stained sword Zhoumu. The great spear dragon winding around the beam was nailed into the ground in front of a spear master. The slender crimson short sabers flew to the top of the city wall and fell into the hands of a machete man. More than a dozen weapons had new owners. After a brief moment of shock, these people, without exception, cupped their fists and bowed to Su Fengnian outside the city to express their gratitude. This was not only because they were happy about Su Fengnian's gift, but also because they were grateful for his recognition of their talents. Among the crowd, a nameless, thin teenager was the most eye-catching. He had actually obtained the great frost long saber that had been returned to its sheath. After being gifted the saber, the teenager could not control the heavy saber that was as heavy as a living thing. He was dragged by the saber for dozens of steps before falling to the ground. Only then did he hug the great frost long saber tightly and grin foolishly. No one could laugh. The teenager was born in the city. His parents were a pair of top assassins who had retired from Jianghu. A few years ago, they had died in a bloody attack by unknown enemies. The teenager ran out of the city with the saber on his shoulder. He told the guy who treated all the masters in the city as nothing that he would follow in the future. As long as he was willing to teach him how to use the saber, Lu Yunzhang, would be willing to work for him. Su Fengnian asked for 3 spacious carriages to carry the goods. An old spy of the Whisking Water House who had been hiding in the martial emperor city for many years came out of the water and drove the first carriage. He could not stop crying as he drove. Lu Yunzhang had mingled with people from all walks of life in the martial emperor city since he was young. He was proficient in everything. He was in charge of the second carriage. His disciple Wang Shang, who had learned how to drive, was in the rear. Su Fengnian sat beside her and continued to talk to her about the basics of martial arts. In addition to the carriage, the old spy also had to take care of 6 horses. The carriage's load was beyond imagination, so horses had to be changed frequently. The 4 people, 3 carriages and 12 horses, along with more than 400 weapons, leisurely drove out of the East Sea. Then, along the southern border of Jingji and Pingfan, they made a small arc. When the team reached the top of the arc, Su Fengnian stood on a mountain near an isolated city pass and looked at the scenery of the south for a long time. Wang Shang and Lu Yunzhang, who were of the same age, did not get along well. Wang Shang could not stand Lu Yunzhang's mischievous smile, and he did not behave properly in front of her master. Lu Yunzhang, on the other hand, did not like the pedantic young man. The 2 of them were at loggerheads. As long as they met, they would quarrel non-stop. However, Lu Yunzhang was not most afraid of the immortal who had given him the saber. In the wise young man's opinion, since the immortal was an expert of the land of immortals, he naturally would not argue with him. However, the slippery Lu Yunzhang was scared to death of the old man who always liked to whisper to the horses. The reason was simple. The old man was an extremely powerful figure in martial emperor city. Rumor had it that he slept in mountains of gold and silver. Even bridegroom, you had borrowed money from this old man surnamed Lu, who was nicknamed the Old Oil Seller. When Su Fengnian stood at the highest point of the terrain and looked to the south, not far away, Wang Shang, in addition to the wooden sword at her waist, was also carrying the red sandalwood sword case on her back. She also had 4 swords tied to the city wall with ropes. They were the moose fish sword, the 3-inch sword dogwood, personally forged by the old northern Han Confucian sage Chao Yi, the talisman sword Wild Crane of the Taoist loose immortal Huang Sishan, and the long sword Biting Pearl that had once pierced through the abdomen of the Emperor of Dongyue. The sword aura was awe-inspiring and cold. It seeped into Wang Shang's skin and caused her lips to turn purple from the cold. Her master didn't say why she had to suffer, only that she would have to carry another sword on her back in less than half a year. In contrast, Lu Yunzhang was too relaxed and content. He carried the large frost saber all day long to show off, as if he had married a beautiful wife. Even when he slept, he would hug her in his arms. At this moment, he was beside Wang Shang. The youth had been imbued with many of the habits of Jianghu. He also knew that, in the sect, seniority was important. Although he and Wang Shang didn't get along well, he didn't want his relationship with this immortal disciple to be too strained. Lu Yunzhang whispered, "Blockhead Wang, what is our master looking at?" Wang Shang's lips were tightly pursed. He just stared at his master's silhouette, unwilling to pay attention to the youth beside him. Lu Yunzhang was used to being ignored by this blockhead. He asked tirelessly, "Do you know who that old green-robed swordsman is? Let me tell you, his identity is extraordinary. He's called Chai Qingshan, an old sword immortal of the Dongyue sword pool. He's the #1 expert of the Guangling Taoist sect. He was once a guest of Zhao Yi. Even the sword pool's sect master, Song Nianqing, has to call him martial uncle. Otherwise, why would our master return him for unfamiliar swords? Of course, it's not that our master is afraid of Chai Qingshan. This is the knowledge between the heroes of Jianghu. Blockhead Wang, you should learn a little." Wang Shang finally couldn't help but turn his head and stare. "Don't keep saying, 'our master.' My master has never acknowledged you as his disciple." Lu Yunzhang reached out and patted the scabbard of the large frost saber. He chuckled and said, "Speak with your conscience. Where can you find such a talented disciple like me? Look at you. You're carrying so many swords, but all of them added together aren't as famous as my saber." Wang Shang didn't want to talk nonsense with him. Chapter 1131. The old spy surnamed Lu was probably done chatting with the horse. He walked over to the two children, squatted down, grabbed a handful of soil in his palm, and sniffed it. Everything had its vanquisher. Lu Yunzhang immediately kept quiet out of fear and took the initiative to sew his mouth shut. Wang Shang wasn't afraid of this taciturn old senior, but he couldn't get close to him either. The old man also didn't deliberately win over the two children who were destined to never cross paths in their lives. However, deep in his heart, he really envied these two children who were extremely lucky. They might not know how great this opportunity was for the time being. The most powerful vassal of the Liang dynasty, the king of Beiliang. He was also the martial artist who had personally killed Wang Xianji. The old man sighed softly for no reason. It's like sitting in a glass screen, surrounded by the wind. It's really been hard on our general's eldest son these years. Wang Shang didn't hear what the old man was muttering, but Lu Yunzhang's ears were sharp. He couldn't help but squat down and ask, "Old Master Lu, what are you talking about? Tell me." The old man rubbed the soil with both hands and looked into the distance. He said indifferently, "It's a coincidence to meet, but it's also the most difficult to understand. Kid, remember to cherish your fortune. You can't find many people with your good luck in the world." Lu Yunzhang didn't say anything. He sat cross-legged and carried the big frost saber on his shoulder. His hands were casually placed on the scabbard, and his eyes were firm. Then they went straight to the northwest. Along the way, no one dared to touch this bad luck. Many of the local first-rate Jianghu sects took the initiative to escort the three carriages. At most, they stood respectfully by the side of the road. When they saw the young vassal on the carriage, they cupped their fists and bowed. No matter how old they were, they all did the Jianghu etiquette as a junior. When the carriage drove into River Province, Wang Shang had 8 swords tied to his body. He looked like a hedgehog, which was quite funny. Today, Su Fengyan was sitting in the carriage of the spy surnamed Lu, chatting about the war of the spring and autumn period. The old spy, whose real name had been abandoned for half his life, looked at the northwest wind that was already very unfamiliar to him and laughed softly. He was already 3 dust baskets of yellow dust with 2 dust baskets on his body. I really didn't think that he would be able to come back alive and smell the wind and sand here. As I get older, even if I can dream of this place, the memories of the old people and things will become blurry. Su Fengyan said calmly, "Martial Emperor City is no longer the focus of the southeast spies. Beimang will soon invade the south. We need you here." The old man nodded. "Even if we take 10,000 steps back, as long as we can die here, it's better than anything else." Su Fengyan smiled and said, "Master often mentioned you when he was alive." The old man lamented, There are many green mountains and clear waters in the southeast. Although they are warm-hearted, they are cold. On the other hand, in the northwest, the sky is cold and the ground is frozen, but they don't feel cold. Su Fengyan smiled and said, "No wonder Master always says that you like to drop bags of books, and privately calls you the sour peddler." The old man was stunned for a moment before he burst into laughter. The old man's expression suddenly turned solemn. Su Fengyan waved his hand and said, "Go on ahead. Don't wait for me." A thin old man appeared on the road. He was empty-handed, but his sword intent was so strong that it was almost as strong as Li Chungang, an earth immortal. Su Fengyan got off the carriage and moved forward slowly. The 3 carriages brushed past the old man with an inconspicuous appearance. When Su Fengyan was about 10 feet away from the old man took a step back. Su Fengyan also stopped. Su Fengyan asked, "Tu Master didn't bring a sword?" The old man with a calm expression did not speak. He just stared at the young man who had turned the Jianghu upside down. The old man finally said slowly, "You're going downhill." Su Fengyan said indifferently, "It's reasonable. Tu Master has indeed chosen a good place and a good time." The old man smiled and said, "Also, did you choose a good opponent?" Su Fengyan did not speak, but a cold smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. The Wu family's sword tomb, the current head of the family, the true owner of the second most famous sword in the world, Su of Gojoseon Wu Jian, an old man who had almost never fought with experts outside the sword tomb, but had become a worthy grandmaster of the sword. To be honest, Su Fengyan was related to the old man. However, when his mother gave up her identity as the sword crown and violated the rules of the Wu family, the sword attendant aunt's face was slashed by countless sword auras. Thus, she had no choice but to wear armor. Su Fengyan did not have a good impression of this old man who his mother said liked to go to the sword tomb mountain year after year to count, wash, and sharpen his swords. Li Chungang had once gone to the sword tomb to obtain the wooden horse and ox sword. Dong Tai was the illegitimate son of the Wu family. He had once lived and died on the sword mountain. In the end, he established his own sect, raised his own flying sword, and became the Peach Blossom Sword God. The top swordsman of 2 generations had not been able to bypass the sword tomb where countless famous swordsmen were buried. Perhaps because Li Chungang was in front of Dong Tai, the old man on the road could not be called the number 1 swordsman. However, there were not many people who could let their guard down. In the past, only Wang Xianji could. Su Fengyan, who had defeated Wang Xianji, could naturally do it as well. However, he could not do it now. The old man's chi was restrained. He did not have the demeanor of an expert. He smiled as if he was chatting with a junior and asked pleasantly, "You asked me why I did not bring my sword?" Su Fengyan frowned, but quickly felt relieved. The old man finally took a step forward. When he came, his sword came. So what if he did not have the Su of Gojoseon? Chapter 1132. The 3 carriages were ordered to stay away from the disturbance, but they didn't go far. The most experienced old spy quickly stopped the carriage. Wang Shang and Lu Yunzhang didn't know what was going on, but they did as they were told. 1 old man and 2 young men stood side by side. Lu Yunzhang saw Wang Shang sweating profusely, his lips turning purple, and his body trembling uncontrollably. Just as Lu Yunzhang was about to laugh at this kid's cowardice, he saw the 7 swords tied to Wang Shang's body. Each of them was slightly unsheathed, especially Wang Shang's newest sword, Goose Yellow. It was tied to his waist, and 2 faint yellow sword auras were coming out from the 2 ends of the scabbard. Lu Yunzhang was experienced and knowledgeable. He knew many bizarre stories of the martial world in Martial the Arch City. He roughly guessed why the immortal young master asked Wang Shang to add a sword every once in a while. It was because he wanted this unnamed disciple to be immersed in the sword aura and gradually connect with those sword embryos. The more, the better. Through this, Wang Shang would be able to hone a natural and vigorous sword intent. The old spy said in a deep voice, "Wang Shang, try your best to use your divine intent to suppress Goose Yellow's sword aura. If you want to cultivate a superior sword, you have to be able to control the sword and not be controlled by the sword." The pale Wang Shang tried his best to nod, but it was a pity that he couldn't do it. Goose Yellow's sword aura was getting denser and denser, and the brilliance was lingering around Wang Shang's waist. The young lady looked like she was wearing a yellow jade belt. The spy with the surname Lu frowned. He knew that these famed swords were attracted by the old man at the post house. Wang Shang was just a beginner in the sword Dao and naturally couldn't restrain it. The old spy originally thought that by stopping here, he could deliver the weapons to the young vassal king in the shortest time possible, and also have enough distance to resist the old man's sword intent. The old spy sighed in his heart. That sword Dao master was too experienced, and Wang Shang was too immature. Lu Yunzhong asked curiously, "Old man Lu, who is that 50 or 60 years old guy? Is he worth Wang Shang's and my immortal master's help?" Back then, even Chai Qingshan was polite and didn't dare to put on the airs of a senior in the martial world. The old spy sneered and said, "Regardless of sword intent or sword arts, how can Chai Qingshan be comparable to the person in front of us? He isn't some old man in his 70s, but an old man in his 90s. Lu Yunzhong said in shock, "Even the number one person in the dynasty's southeast, Chai Qingshan, can't compare? How many swordsmen in the world can scare people like that? That old man doesn't look like the Peach Blossom Divine Swordsman Dong Tai. I heard that Divine Swordsman Deng is very young. Even if he doesn't carry a peach blossom branch, he will probably ride a little donkey in Jianghu." The old spy said in a heavy tone, "He is the tomb master of the Wu family's sword tomb. In terms of seniority, your master should call him great-grandpa." Lu Yunzhong was most annoyed by those who practiced the sword in the martial world. They practiced for decades and still didn't have any great achievements. How could they have the spirit to drag someone away with a swing of their saber? Playing with a saber was more enjoyable. However, the Wu family's sword tomb was a place shrouded in clouds and fog. The youth had only heard that there was a large group of half-dead, withered swordsmen sitting there. The old spy kept sizing up Wang Shang as he spoke. He saw that her cultivation was still too shallow. Not only was she unable to suppress the eruption of Goose Yellow's sword aura, but the four swords of Mothfish, Dogwood, Wild Crane, and Pearl were still relatively quiet. The two new swords, Little Dizzy and Youthful Swim, were all showing signs of being completely unsheathed. The old spy felt some regret. This was the first time this child had coincidentally sharpened her sword, but she had failed to face the difficulties head-on. This was especially disadvantageous for her future cultivation. The old spy waited for a moment. He didn't want Wang Shang and the sword executors to be defeated because of their personal feelings, so he planned to retreat. At this moment, Wang Shang seemed to be very angry. She lowered her head and stared at the most restless Goose Yellow. She reprimanded, "Be obedient." Lu Yunzhong rolled his eyes, and the old spy didn't know whether to laugh or cry. However, the two of them were surprised to find that the famous sword had indeed calmed down. Most of the sword aura had been withdrawn and returned to its sheath. The remaining sword aura floated up and flowed around Wang Shang's 10 fingers. The girl's fingertips were like a yellow flower. The corner of Lu Yunzhong's mouth twitched. He said helplessly, "This works too." Although the old spy's face was calm, he was terrified. In every generation of the martial world, there would be a handful of geniuses. Among these rare geniuses, Buddhism and Taoism were the most mysterious. It was rumored that Qi Xuanjun had the mysterious ability of prophecy. Back then, on the demon-slaying platform, he had single-handedly fought the 6 skyscraping demons of Zhulu Mountain. 3 of them had died under the great immortal Qi's incantation. The white-robed monks of the 2 Zen temples were also said to have a secret mantra that could determine one's life and death. As for the people of the Way of the Sword, they could make many famous swords of spiritual Qi feel close to them. They were called natural sword embryos. While the old spy felt relieved, he couldn't help but mock himself. When he was young, he was also regarded by many seniors as having outstanding talent. It was just that he had never been taught by a true master. As a result, he had no interest in instructing others. What he learned was a mixture of different things. In the end, he was unable to go far on the martial path. Regardless of one's aptitude, having a guide often determined one's level of achievement. The old spy hesitated for a moment before saying, "Wang Shang, Follow me for 10 steps. Wang Sheng grunted. Lu Yunzhong said impatiently, Old Master Lu, what about me? The old spy said unhappily, Stay where you are and keep an eye on the carriage. Lu Yunzhong sighed heavily. He turned his head and glanced at the 5-foot-long frost blade on his shoulder. We'll depend on each other for survival. At the front of the post house, after the head of the Wu family took a step forward, there was no more movement. However, what was even more unexpected was that the old man didn't seem to be in a life-and-death situation. He actually began to ramble, and his words were filled with emotion. My ancestors once said that when I was born, there was a strange phenomenon in the sky. 9 flood dragons were in the sky, and 8 flood dragons took away 9 famous swords from the Sword Mountain. 1 flood dragon coiled around the Sword Mountain, lying on the ancient sword Xiaonyo. On the first day I started practicing the sword, the ancestor who personally taught me the sword told me that after I pulled out the Xiaonyo, I had to leave the tomb every 10 years to search for a sword. Chapter 1133. When I was 10, I climbed Sword Mountain in search of a sword and was able to pull out Xiaonyo. When I was 20, I went deep into the mountains of Liaodong and found Qiwan at the bottom of a lake. When I was 30, I found Chao Feng in the Forest of Steels in the wilderness of northern Han. When I was 40, I traveled to West Chu to teach Manjushri and met Baian on the Buddhist throne. When I was 50, I went to Shu to find Jiao Tuesday. When I was 60, I went to the southern border to seek revenge. I inadvertently saw Yazi nailed to a towering ancient tree. When I was 70, I found Xia under a stone slab on an ancient bridge in Great and City. When I was 80, I went to the old Dongyue kingdom to visit friends and met Pu Lao inside an ancient bell. When I was 90, I entered Great and City and saw Pai Xiu. Now I have gathered 9 swords. My life should have been complete. When the old man reached this point, he smiled. In this life, other than searching for swords, I have only ever searched for swords. I have never asked why I practiced the sword. Every 10 years, I would ponder how to abandon the sword and obtain its intent. 10 years after 10 years, I have truly missed many people and many sceneries. Su Fengyan raised his head and gazed at the sky. In his field of vision, there was a sea of golden clouds. Sunlight sprinkled down like feathers, gorgeous and moving. Afterwards, the sea of clouds was like a piece of satin that had been ruthlessly pierced through by an awl, creating a slightly slanted opening. Su Fengyan did not move at all. However, a dozen or so famed swords from a carriage flew towards the opening in the sea of clouds. A massive sound exploded in the sky, like the striking of a bell, shattering one's eardrums. One could faintly see that the dozen or so famed swords that had been uprooted from the ground were all broken and fell to the ground. Wind and high spirits flew out from the sea of bamboo in western Shu. With Su Fengyan as the center, they circled around in a large circle, forming a prison and trapping Su Fengyan. Then sword qi swept out from northern Han, transforming into 10 fragments. Each fragment was a sword, and the 10 swords became 1 qi. It was as if an immortal was leading the way. A majestic aura came from the northeast. A long rainbow pierced through the sky. With Liaodong as the starting point of the sword momentum and Hezhou as the landing point of the sword momentum, it drew a shockingly huge semicircle. It was wrapped in a stream of water mist, trying to repel the fire. Then, a qi appeared from the distant southeast. The sword qi, filled with an ancient intent. There was a total of 9 streaks of sword qi, each with their own merits. The old tomb master of the Wu family spent a total of 90 years to find the 9 swords. He did not use the ancient swords themselves to fight against his enemies, but only took the will of the swords for his own use. The old man had indeed chosen a good time to show himself. When he was rushing to River Province, the sword qi had already risen from the ground. If there really was an immortal who could look down on the mortal world from the 9 heavens, he would be able to see the 9 streams of sword qi coming from all directions on the ground, all heading towards the same destination, where Su Fengyan was standing. Su Fengyan had been standing in the same place all along, but other than the red sandalwood sword box on Wang Sheng's back and the 7 bound swords, all the famous swords on the 3 carriages had already flown out of the carriages to fight the enemy. About 300 meters behind Su Fengyan, A large section of the road was torn apart by the thunderclaps. There were 2 places at different heights besides Su Fengnian. One was 70 feet away, while the other was 60 feet away. More than 20 famous swords were destroyed before they could enter Bailiang's territory. There was even a chi that fell from the sky, scattering a cloud of fine powder 4 feet away from Su Fengnian's head. The streaks of sword chi were getting closer and closer to Su Fengnian. They were aggressive. The Yazi sword will with the heaviest killing intent swept over, destroying the 12 ancient swords with Gu Changjian in the lead. However, the mottled and messy sword chi had already surged to 20 feet in front of Su Fengnian. However, the sword chi that came right after was the most powerful, like a ferocious beast that could swallow all things without spilling out. Su Fengnian spread out his hand and summoned a clothes-tamping sword. The 2 swords perished together. However, Su Fengnian had also retreated 10 feet, but the sword chi had closed in on him by 20 feet. At this moment, the old man still had 2 streaks of sword chi that he had yet to use. One was the sword chi of the pepper diagram that swam around in a circle, and the other was the sword chi of Chonyo that had never appeared. It was obvious that the old man was already 10 feet away from Su Fengnian. On the other hand, Su Fengnian had almost no swords left to use. The 3 carriages had hidden swords, leaving behind only the sword Immortal Chan Qingming's relic, Zibuyu, and an ancient sword of unknown origin. The sword's body was engraved with the words, plucked string. Zibuyu hovered behind Su Fengnian, holding the plucked string sword in his hand. He held the sword hilt with one hand and pressed 2 fingers on the tip of the sword with the other hand. Pressing the sword's body into an arc, Su Fengnian removed the hand gesture of holding and flicking the sword at the same time, and silently said, "Go!" The plucked string sword spun non-stop and disappeared in a flash. Zibuyu also flew behind him. At the same time, the old man who had only taken 1 step forward in the battle finally began to move forward. It was as if he had been patiently waiting for this moment. The man and the sword arrived. This was the old man's 10th sword. If the 9 swords were a gift from God, the old man who had lived for almost 100 years had also practiced 1 sword. In an instant, the old man broke through the 10 feet distance of Su Fengnian's imminent skyline. The 9 treasured flying swords were all deflected by the old Tomb Lord's majestic sword chi. 2 fingers were pointed at Su Fengnian's forehead. But Su Fengnian's fist was also on the old man's chest. The old man said softly, "Very good." Su Fengnian slowly retracted his fist, somewhat puzzled. The old man said with relief, "At this point, you are still willing to exchange your life for his. Great-grandpa has lost." Su Fengnian didn't know what to do when he heard the strange name. The old man touched Su Fengnian's head with a kind expression and said, "Great-grandpa was worried about others standing here, so he had to come here himself to escort you. I know you won't recognize me as your elder, and the sword tomb has indeed wronged little Su. But nothing can be accomplished without rules. Every family has its own difficulties. Your great-grandpa had no choice but to be the bad guy back then." Su Fengnian's lips trembled, but he still didn't say the 3 words. The old man didn't care. He retracted his hand and took a few steps back. He carefully looked at his great-grandson and smiled. Every family has its own rules. If great-grandpa didn't do this, there would be no reason for me to give you a gift that has been owed for many years. The old man continued, "The Wu family once broke through 10,000 cavalry with 9 swords. Great-grandpa was able to practice the sword himself, but not as the head of the family. Now, not to mention 9 swords, even 19 swords and 29 swords can't break through the 10,000 cavalry of Beimang. Your great-grandpa has never liked Su Shao, his grandson-in-law, who told him to be so weak in martial arts. Even now, I still feel that this bastard is not worthy of little Su." It seemed that the old man was talking to himself. Su Fengnian, the nominal great-grandson, was silent. The old man laughed heartily. "Great-grandpa is very happy to see you." The old man had probably seen enough of this extremely promising and appetizing great-grandson. When he passed by the young man, he patted the young man's shoulder and said, "Don't shoulder everything by yourself." The old man walked away with his back to the stubborn young man who still hadn't called him great-grandpa. One day, More than 100 people will leave the sword tomb of the Wu family and enter Beiliang on horseback with swords. Chapter 11:34. After the battle, Lu Yunzhang reluctantly followed the three to pick up the broken limbs of the famous swords. The youth really couldn't understand why his immortal master was so fussy about daily necessities like a housewife when he already had such a wealth. Wang Sheng wasn't as heartless as Lu Yunzhang, who had a sad expression when picking up the swords. Lu Yunzhang was a swordsman who looked down on swordsmanship. But she was different. She couldn't help but feel sad when she saw dozens of famous divine weapons being destroyed. When Lu Yunzhang threw the last broken sword into the carriage, he caught a glimpse of Wang Sheng's absent-minded appearance. He teased that Wang Sheng was like a girl, but a little too tall and big. Wang Sheng angrily reached out and grabbed Goose Yellow at his waist. In an instant, a sword aura was formed, and it couldn't be underestimated. The bold Lu Yunzhang wasn't afraid at all. He grinned, revealing a mouthful of white teeth. His palm spun around the hilt of his frost-long saber. His eyes were blazing as he asked Wang Sheng if they wanted to fight. Whoever won would be the first disciple of his immortal master. Wang Sheng's face changed, but he didn't speak. For a moment, the young boy and girl were in a deadlock. The old spy couldn't stand such a childish infighting and wanted to punish each of them 50 times to let the two brats know the severity of the matter. But he didn't expect that the young lord not only didn't mediate, but also added fuel to the fire. He wanted them to make a vow to fight 3 years later. Afterwards, the old spy privately inquired about the reason. Su Fengyan laughed and said that he deliberately let the two children be each other's whetstones. Moreover, he wouldn't hide anything from either side. He would teach them the best swordsmanship and saber techniques in the world. He also wanted to see the outcome of this battle. When the carriage arrived at the border of Yuzhou, Lu Yunzhang heard a rush of galloping horse hooves that he had never heard before. It was a single sound, but it was abnormally heavy. The youth quickly let go of the reins and jumped onto the horse's back. He looked up and saw a scene that he would never forget for the rest of his life. Hundreds of elite cavalry were all white horses and white armor. They wore cold sabers and carried powerful crossbows. The movement of the horses' backs was exactly the same as the movement of the horses' hooves. No wonder they were galloping on the road. The horses of Beiliang and the cold sabers of the Su family were treasures that the other lords of Liang coveted. Lu Yunzhang couldn't be compared to the ignorant Wang Sheng. The martial emperor city was filled with crooks and honest people. The curious Lu Yunzhang had a rough understanding of the affairs of the Jianghu and the imperial court. Along the way to the west, the youth roughly guessed the identity of the immortal young master. However, as a Jianghu youth who lived in the streets of the Eastern Sea, he didn't know the scenery of the northwest frontier fortress. He also couldn't imagine the magnificence of the cavalry of the Northwest Su family. Now that he saw it with his own eyes, the youth had the most intuitive impression. He felt that if he was given a few thousand cavalrymen, no matter how many experts there were in the martial emperor city, he would be able to crush them a few times. For a moment, the youth was a little dazed. He felt that if he were to practice his saber behind closed doors, it would be better to go to the border and practice a saber that could kill people. Half of the 800 white horse cavalrymen arrived. When they saw Prince Liang, they dismounted and knelt down. Su Fengyan casually glanced around. Most of them were new faces. This wasn't strange. Back then, most of the cavalrymen were his trusted aides and had infiltrated into the various armies, especially those who had followed him to the Iron Gate Pass to assassinate Prince Zhao Kai. Most of them had high official positions. Although their official ranks weren't high, they had some real power in their hands. Some of the young people who had shown outstanding performance on the battlefield, such as the ruthless Hong Shuwen, were like carps jumping over the dragon's gate. They had a bright future ahead of them. Su Fengyan raised his arm, indicating for the white horse cavalrymen to get on their horses and continue on their journey. Su Fengyan didn't go straight to the prince's residence in Liangzhou. Midway, he turned south to Lingzhou. He only brought Wang Sheng and Lu Yunzhang with him. The old spy followed the white horse cavalrymen into Liangzhou first. Then, they went to Chu Lushan's Fu Shui room for the roll call. Su Fengyan was going to see the Tangerine provincial governor, Su Beiji, whom he had kidnapped from Beimang. The northwest solar terms were connected by spring and autumn. Thus, it was known as the long winter without summer. It wasn't that there wasn't a hot summer season. When it should be hot, it was often much hotter than other places. The ground was high and the sky was close, and there was nowhere to hide. Naturally, the sun was fierce. However, it was close to the beginning of autumn, and there was no sign of a cool breeze. This made Lu Yunzhong, who was not acclimatized to the climate, feel a little sick. Wang Sheng, who had been tortured by life at the bottom, was still fine. He practiced his sword diligently as usual. Huangnam County, which they passed through on their way south, was where Beiliang's granary was located. The reed stream was continuous, and the water was fertile. It was not only the throat of the fortress, but also the waist of the Liangshi corridor. At this time, the middle rice and corn were beginning to be filled with milk and ripened, while the late rice was beginning to grow. The cotton was cracking and spitting out cotton. It was a unique style of Jiangnan beyond the Great Wall. The two children clicked their tongues in wonder. Along the way south, the two children were always more eye-catching than Su Fengnian. One carried a white scabbard broadsword, the other carried a case on his back, and there were 7 or 8 swords tied to his body. They didn't look like young wanderers at all. Instead, they looked like inferior swordsmen. Before the 3 of them entered the capital of Lingzhou, they met an escort team on the official road that was also heading south. Everyone was riding tall horses, and the carriage was particularly luxurious. It had a banner with the word Lu embroidered on it, and there was a black and gold fish dragon. For some reason, the escort team got into a dispute with a group of foreign scholars. Logically speaking, Beiliang relied heavily on scholars who came to Liangshi. As long as they had some real talent, they would be given an important position. Normal people should avoid them. However, the escort team didn't say anything and beat up the brightly dressed scholars until they cried for their parents. After the pain, their eyes were filled with resentment. Lu Yunzhong was very clear about the workings of the Jianghu. When he saw the banner, he said with envy, "Wang Mutu, open your eyes wide and look. It's the Fish Dragon Gang, one of the top 10 sects in the Jianghu. Although it's not as noble as the snow villa by the spring deity lake, and it's not as high and mighty as the missing moon house on the great snow plains of Mount Hui, the Fish Dragon Gang dares to accept anyone from the Jianghu. It doesn't matter if you're a bandit or a bandit. As long as you have the ability, you can get a position in the Fish Dragon Gang. Therefore, this gang is famous for having a lot of people, and they don't care about anyone. If any of the sects outside of Beiliang provoke the Fish Dragon Gang, even if it's a province away, the Fish Dragon Gang will dare to send 100 or 200 people to kill them. The local government doesn't even dare to fart." Chapter 1135. Su Fengnian did not do anything. Later on, he met Provincial Governor Su Beiji at an old location called the Jaha Granary outside of Lingzhou City. This granary was once the largest granary in the ancient world. Its scale did not lose out to the 2 imperial granaries in Great Peace City and Guangling Road. The north was Jingyu and the south was Ganlu. The 2 were known in the world. However, the Jaha granary had not been used for many dynasties and was completely abandoned. It only had a large frame. When the administrator Li Gongda was the provincial governor of Lingzhou, he had thought about repairing the granary. Unfortunately, no one responded. It was difficult to do it alone, so he could only give up. First, repairing the Jaha granary required a large amount of silver. Second, moving the grain into the granary required great courage. Furthermore, once the grain entered the granary, it was the same as the government becoming a chicken rib. It was the same as having to spend silver every day to raise the grain. Normal granaries could still exchange new grain for old grain to earn money that could not see the light of day. However, once the Jaha granary was used again, it was destined to be an important military location that even the young kings had to keep an eye on. Who dared to do anything to this place? Were they tired of living? The newly appointed provincial governor Su Beiji acted alone under these circumstances. He did not hesitate to overdraft the Lingzhou tax and decided to renovate the Jaha granary. In the eyes of the sly officials, the provincial governor was doing it once and for all, but in the dark, he was biting off more than he could chew. The old foxes in the Lingzhou officialdom did not dare to do nothing in the open, but they secretly set up many obstacles. If the Jiahe granary was really messed up by that rash young man, it would cut off countless people's income. A Jiahe granary could not only take in the entire Lingzhou tax to pay for the salaries of officials and the local military, it could also reduce the price of grain to prepare for famine relief. This allowed the tyrannical private granaries of the people to use natural disasters and man-made to obtain huge profits. From the top to the bottom, from the ranking officials to the odd job workers, they all tacitly worked but did not put in effort. Furthermore, there were often disputes that hindered the progress of the project. Sir Su, who was mocked as the provincial governor of Grain Province, did not fly into a rage over this and did not punish the chicken to warn the monkey. He only borrowed 2,000 armored soldiers from the general of Lingzhou and then asked for 3,000 strong corvée laborers from Huangnam County and Longqing County that he could control. He almost completely ignored the orthodox officialdom in Lingzhou. At the same time, he sent Song Yan to clean up the official granaries in Lingzhou. Once he found that there were illegal actions, he would not make a big fuss. At most, he would remove the official hat and replace it with a foreign scholar with a clean background. Most likely, the Lingzhou officialdom did not suffer unbearable turmoil. However, a small group of insightful people finally realized this and began to frequently go to the much quieter official residence in Lingzhou. The Jiahe granary was heavily guarded. Su Fengyan also did not reveal his identity. He only asked a young military officer to help him pass on a message, saying that the prefect of Bishan County of Yanji County in Yuzhou was an old acquaintance of the provincial governor. Su Beiji, who had been sleeping and eating in the open at the old site of the Jiahe granary, quickly rushed over. He was even more travel-worn than Su Fengyan. The youngest provincial governor in Beiliang history looked exhausted, but he seemed to be in good spirits. After seeing Su Fengyan, he was not surprised and silently walked side by side. This gave the military officer a fright. The construction of the Jiahe granary was in full swing. Su Beiji was seen as the prodigal son of Lingzhou. He raised his sleeve to wipe his dusty face and said as he walked, "The Jiahe granary was the second granary of the Qin dynasty 800 years ago. It was only slightly inferior to Luoyang's granary. It was called a granary, but in reality it was no different from a city with both offensive and defensive capabilities. The granary city was 1.5 li from east to west and 2 li from north to south. There were more than 300 granaries and no less than 50 granaries. However, this was not all. When it was renovated, one could clearly see the ancient words carved on the bricks describing the source of the grain, the time it was stored in the granary, and the name of the official who was conferred the granary. Every era of the Qin dynasty had declined, and all of this could be traced. I originally thought that worshipping the past was a bad habit, but after coming to the Jiahe granary, I realized that there were some things that the ancients did better." Su Fengyan smiled and said, "The wisdom of the people has gradually developed, and there are both good and bad. Otherwise, the ancestors of Taoism would not have brought up the saying that the saints had abandoned wisdom and that the morals of the world were declining with each passing day. It will be mentioned more and more in the future. There are already very few scholars in Beiliang, but they are still very clever in the officialdom. If you were in Jiangnan where the rich and powerful families intertwined with each other, you would truly not be able to display your talents. Here, after all, there is still the suppression of military officials, and the time for civil officials to raise their heads is, after all, short." Su Beiji sighed and said in a deep voice, "As long as the Jiahe granary is completed, with this year's harvest in the 3 provinces as a source of grain, it will be enough to support the war on the border for 2 years. However, the prerequisite is that the various provinces and counties do not embezzle from one another, and the people withdraw their claws and do not get involved. Otherwise, not to mention 2 years, even half a year is an extravagant hope. Time does not wait for me. Actually, if we can plan slowly, I can even have the local grain merchants go to other provinces to buy grain at a high price to fill the cold. This bit of silver is nothing. Once the war starts, not to mention gold and silver, even land will not be as valuable as ready-made grain. However, 20 years of peace within Beiliang has become their confidence for being short-sighted. It is really laughable. Those who brought their children and grandchildren out of the country have even spread the word that even if the grain in the granary rots to the ground, they will not sell a single grain of good rice to the Jaha granary at a high price. This reminds me of what Grandpa said about the disputes between neighbors. If you only have 1 cent of silver and your neighbor gets 3 cents of silver, then you would rather everyone not earn a single cent than let the other family get 2 cents more. No matter how angry he was, Su Beiji's tone was always calm and indifferent. Su Fengnian stopped in front of a granary with gray tiles. He said with a slight smile, "Ling Zhou is so excited to disgust you, just let them be. However, I can guarantee you that the autumn grain from Liang and Yu provinces will definitely be stuffed into the Jaha granary. At that time, those fellows who escaped when I was Ling Zhou's general will settle the score with you. Anyway, from today onwards, the so-called priceless antiques will follow them out of Beiliang. Take as much as you can, but don't even think about taking 1 tael of silver or gold or 1 caddy of white rice out." Su Beiji said with a cold smile without holding back, "Wishful thinking. Do you think you can do it? If the water is too clear, there will be no fish. Which of those generals and commandants guarding the border is not related?" Su Fengnian said helplessly, "It's better than not doing anything, right?" Su Beiji's expression relaxed a little and he nodded. When the vassal king beside him swaggered out of Lingzhou, he did not really touch the bottom line of Lingzhou's officialdom. With the Lingzhou general and his royal highness protecting him, no one really dared to fall out with him. However, when Su Beiji personally took charge of Lingzhou, where dragons and snakes were mixed together, it was hard to avoid touching the bottom line of the local officials and families. Furthermore, Su Beiji was not like Li Gongda, an old man in Beiliang who suddenly became a noble. Even with Song Yan and the 4 Wang families helping him out and the Lingzhou general helping him, the officialdom had always been complicated and hard to predict. Laws, relationships, clan rules, and all kinds of rules were mixed within. They all had conflicts and were a mess. The so-called cutting the Gordian knot with a knife could only succeed for a while and would leave behind a long-lasting disaster. Su Beiji was in the middle of it. As long as he did something, he would naturally make enemies on all sides. Chun Shiliang, who had taken care of the salt policy and the transport of grain, was an example. It was not that Chun Shiliang did not have good medicine at that time, but so what if he had a strategy? Didn't he still hit a wall everywhere? Su Beiji sneered in his heart. He had a soft personality and could be bullied by everyone. How could he stand on his own in Beiliang where the people were strong? In Liuzhou, the 4th province of the land of refugees, even if Chun Shiliang successfully defended the city and did not let nearly 10,000 horse gang break through, he was still criticized for being indecisive and soft-hearted. In the future, even if he had the chance to take charge of a territory, he would not be able to make any achievements in local politics. Su Fengnian suddenly asked, "The Fish Dragon gang frequently engaged in border trade. Did they break any rules?" Su Beiji said, "There are spies keeping an eye on them. Since no spies reported to the provincial governor's office, they probably did not break any rules." After pausing for a moment, Su Beiji frowned and asked, "Did they break any rules?" Su Fengnian shook his head and said, "I don't think so." Su Beiji said calmly, "That woman surnamed Lu has yet to pay me a visit, probably to avoid arousing suspicion. However, a woman like her, who is not magnanimous, is destined to be the leader of a second-rate gang in a prefecture. She is destined to be the leader of one of the top gangs in Jianghu." Su Fengnian smiled and said, "It's not her fault. It's been hard on her. She should have been an ordinary Jianghu heroine." Su Beiji suddenly said, "Since you came back alive, why don't you hurry back to Mount Qingliang? I've already prepared some thorns for you." Su Fengnian said bitterly, "It's useless to bring a thorns and ask for punishment from second sister." Su Beiji's face was filled with undisguised schadenfreude. Then, Su Beiji ordered a large portion of food for the king of Beiliang who had yet to eat. The Jaha granary had always treated everyone equally, with pickled vegetables and steamed buns. Su Beiji and Su Fengnian both squatted down to eat. Lu Yunchang very heroically sat cross-legged with his blade across his chest. He also asked for a jug of the famous green ant wine from Beiliang. In the end, he choked on it until his face turned red. Wang Sheng carried his case and tied his sword. He could not squat down, so he could only stand. Su Beiji smiled and asked, "Are they all your disciples?" Su Fengnian grunted in acknowledgement. Lu Yunchang smiled mischievously and said, "This is Lingzhou's Lord Official. My name is Lu Yunchang, and I am from the Eastern Sea's martial emperor city. I am Master's eldest disciple. I hope Lord Official can take care of me in the future." Su Beiji heard the youth's cultured words and dismissed it with a smile. Wang Sheng snorted coldly. Su Fengnian smiled and said, "They can be considered as my second and third disciples. My eldest disciple is a shepherd boy, but he is still by Su Yanbing's side." Lu Yunchang stared and said, "What? Wang Sheng is not even the eldest disciple. Immortal Master, then why would I fight with Wang Sheng 3 years later? Even if we fight, we will only be second. It's meaningless." Su Fengnian said indifferently, "Drink your wine." The youth drank his wine obediently, showing respect for his master. Su Beiji asked softly, "What did Guangling Road say?" Su Fengnian said calmly, "It will be in the next few days." Su Beiji sighed and said, "When the smoke signal rises, does this mean that someone in the Liang dynasty's imperial court is welcoming the last ray of light?" Su Fengnian grunted expressionlessly, "If the old doesn't go, the new won't come." Chapter 1136. In Longqing County, Zhong Hanguo, a general of Huaihua City who had retired to his hometown, died. In the end, a nameless fish dragon gang appeared out of nowhere. Not only did the fish dragon gang take over most of the waterway business in Longqing County, they even relied on smuggling at the border. It was said that they could make money from both sides of the upper echelons of Lingzhou and Yuzhou. The new top 10 sects in Jianghu were full of vigor and were not as lethargic as before. Undoubtedly, Mount Huishanzi was the biggest winner. Not only did they make their moonless house in the Great Snow Plateau enter the top 3, surpassing the declining Longhu sect and the thriving Wudong sect, they stood shoulder to shoulder with the Wu family's sword tomb and Lantuo Mountain. They also brought the Spring God Lake's Snow Mountain Villa to the sky. Later on, there was the Dragon Palace that was ridiculed as Mr. Nalin's maid in Nanjiang, the new sect in the north, and the Spring Invitation Cottage led by the Beauty Xie in the West Shu Bamboo Sea. The Fish Dragon Gang of Northern Liang's Lingzhou, which ranked at the bottom, was the most unexpected upstart. They did not have a top-level one master as their stabilizing force, nor did they have a deep foundation to show off. However, after a few fights with hundreds of talents in the gang, they had annexed a few gangs from other provinces. There were no longer people who mocked and ridiculed them all day long. The young female gang leader's reputation continued to rise. However, for some reason, she rarely showed herself. Most of the time, she was in charge of the affairs of the foreign guests who were suspected of occupying the gang's territory. In the past, Jianghu was full of men and not enough of women. The so-called heroines and fairies were just decorations that could not cause much trouble. However, it was different now. Among the top 10 sects, there were 4 female leaders, the leader of Wulin Alliance Shenyuan Qingfeng, the new palace master of Dragon Palace Lin Hongyuan, Xie from West Shu, and Lu Narong from the Fish Dragon Gang. They were almost on par with the men. However, among the 4 women, Lu Narong was undoubtedly the most inconspicuous. She did not have the beauty of Xie, nor did she have the peak martial arts of Shenyuan Qingfeng. She even vaguely retreated behind the scenes in the Fish Dragon Gang like a puppet. Many locals of Lingzhou couldn't help but feel indignant for him. It had always been the bigger shop bullying the customers. How could there be the logic of the bigger customers bullying the shop? In the famous Nanxiangzi restaurant in Longqing County, a heroic-looking woman went up alone. She ordered a few signature seasonal dishes and drank wine by the window. The manager was an old man in Longqing County. He had a close relationship with old gang leader Lu, who had already retired. Seeing this young woman who he had watched grow up with his own eyes, he felt sad and sympathetic. However, the old man knew the woman's temperament, so he couldn't show it on his face. He could only ask someone to find a good wine that had been stored in the cellar for many years. He personally opened the mud seal and accompanied the woman to drink a bowl of hot, strong wine. They talked about the Jianghu deeds of old Master Lu when he was young. When the old shopkeeper saw the group of people arrogantly climbing up the stairs, he sighed and silently got up to leave. Every family had its own difficulties, not to mention that the Fish Dragon gang today was not something that an old wine seller like him could meddle in. The woman looked up and saw that the three people were the guests who had joined the Fish Dragon gang in 2 batches. The burly man in his prime was originally a notorious machete man in Yuzhou who carried a famous knife called zongyi. The old man was one of the top internal experts in Huzhou. He was close to level 2 and had the reputation of being a painter. The young and handsome man was the most powerful of the 3. He was also good at using subtle hidden weapons, which made it impossible for people to guard against him. He was the top Jianghu talent in Gangnam-do. At present, the Fish Dragon gang claimed to have 4 great masters and 18 guests. The 3 of them were the confidants of the second master, Jiang Zishi. Jiang Zishi, the devil who was born in Nanjiang, had once killed Xian Zhenren of a venerated Taoist temple in the south, when he was only at level 2. Not to mention Jiang Zishi, who should have been executed in Jianghu. Even Su Dachang, the machete man who carried the zongyi knife, was a tricky character that no one in the old Fish Dragon gang could compete with except for old Master Lu. In such a gang where all kinds of fish and dragons were mixed, except for an almost invincible woman like Huishan Zi, no one could control such a large group of domineering people who were united. The painter Su Kunshan had been in Jianghu for a long time and was a shrewd old man. Although he looked down on the girl from the bottom of his heart, he still called her old Master Lu in a pleasant manner. Su Dachang held the handle of the zongyi knife with one hand and sat down casually with a sarcastic face. He poured himself a glass of wine. At this moment, the Fish Dragon gang had a large number of people and could be said to be strong and powerful. It was like those guys who were in charge of smuggling at the border and no one knew where they came from. They could even swagger with light crossbows and even the government could only turn a blind eye to it. This group of people were all subordinates of the great master, Fang Gaoqi. However, Fang Gaoqi had never participated in the power struggle of the Fish Dragon gang. Everyone guessed that this guy most likely had a background in the Beiliang army, so naturally no one dared to provoke him. However, the other 3 great masters, including Jiang Zishi, were all people of Jianghu who knew their own ins and outs very well. The 3 of them fought with each other and supported each other. Soon, the nominal gang leader in front of them became a mere figurehead. The young woman could not convince the crowd, so how could she compete with these old men who were well-versed in the rules of Jianghu? Not only did she gradually lose her voice, but she was also reduced to being used as a bet by 2 young guests. After the handsome man sat down, he stared at the woman across the table and asked with a smile, "Narong, today I will have a martial arts competition with Song Chunqiao at Yaohua Lake. Would you like to cheer for me?" Lu Narong's eyes were cold and did not show much emotion. Chapter 1137. Su Dachang couldn't bear to see this little girl's cold appearance the most. He was like many outsiders in the gang. When he first joined the Fish Dragon gang, he heard that His Royal Highness had visited the gang and had some friendship with this girl called Lu Narong. Therefore, at first, they restrained themselves and behaved honestly. There were even some who hoped to use the Fish Dragon gang as a springboard to gain the favor of the new Prince Liang. Plus, they might be able to get an official position in Lingzhou. However, after being in the Fish Dragon gang for a long time, no one believed that the young prince had much connection with the gang. Even if there was, it was just a short-lived relationship. First, Lu Narong was not a beautiful girl. Second, if she was really a wild sparrow raised by the Lord of Beiliang, why didn't the Fish Dragon gang come out of the prince's mansion of Liangzhou when the Fish Dragon gang was about to change its surname? Su Dachang took off his knife and slammed it on the table. Then he picked up a cup of wine and handed it to Lu Narong. He smiled sinisterly. "Gang leader, do you want to drink a toast or a forfeit?" The handsome man smiled and glared at Su Dachang. "Brother Su, how can you be so rude to the gang leader?" Su Dachang put down the wine cup and said with a fake smile, "I don't recognize any gang leader. If it's my sister-in-law, I'll treat it as a big deal." Lu Narong finally asked calmly, "Chigume, I heard that the outcome of your martial arts competition with Song Chunqiao decided who I belong to?" The young master, who had the demeanor of a famous scholar in Jiang, and said innocently, "Narong, are you angry?" Lu Narong glanced at him and sneered, "Why don't we postpone it for a few days? Since it's a martial arts competition, the more important the person is, the more fun it will be. I'll try to invite the provincial governor of Lingzhou." Qi Gumei said with a smile. Provincial Governor Su is in charge of the affairs of a province and is very busy every day. I'm afraid that Narong won't be able to invite him. Su Dachang crossed his legs, took a sip of wine, and sneered, "Gang leader Lu, don't try to puff yourself up at your own cost. Our brothers have already found out everything about the Fish Dragon gang. Do you still want to have a relationship with a third-class border governor? Even if you don't feel embarrassed, I feel embarrassed for you. Besides, with your mediocre skills, you might as well be a good housewife for Brother Qi. If the Fish Dragon gang is left to Brother Qi to manage, with Elder Zhang's deterrence, the Fish Dragon gang will be on the right path. Why didn't you choose the suave and elegant Brother Qi? Are you blind to choose that short Song Chunxiao? He's as black as charcoal." Speaking of this, Su Dachang laughed out loud, his eyes burning with filth. Song Chun's orifices are a complete mess, but sect leader's skin is still fair. If we meet each other in bed, it will be quite interesting. Lu Narong was about to teach this reckless person a lesson, but Su Kunshan, who had been watching coldly from the side, smiled and tapped the table with his finger. The wine cup in front of Lu Narong's table jumped a foot high, and then, under the influence of the leakage of qi, the wine cup stopped. This trick was definitely not something that Lu Narong could do. Qi Gumei, who had been observing Lu Narong, suddenly frowned. He saw a flash of brilliance that he had never seen before in the woman's eyes, but it quickly disappeared. Su Dachang turned his head and saw 3 people, one big and 2 small, walking up the stairs to the 2nd floor. The one in the middle was even more beautiful than Qi Gumei. The 2 little brats beside him didn't look like normal people either. One of them had his hands lazily resting on a long knife on his shoulder, while the other had a sword tied to his back. They looked funny like a hedgehog. This was a rare scene in Lingzhou. Bailiang was much more boring than the Jianghu outside. Not many people liked to pay attention to fancy gimmicks. It was related to the customs of the people, and most of them were straightforward. Many of the newcomers in the Fish Dragons were not used to it at first. This place was far from the Jianghu of the Central Plains, where people liked to nag for a long time before a fight, talking about who was the master, the reason, the rules, and so on. But here, people often fought when they wanted to. Even if 2 people didn't like to look at each other, they would pull out their knives and fight to the death. The 3 unfamiliar faces in front of him were obviously more outstanding. Su Dachang didn't act rashly. There were as many seedlings in Lingzhou as there were hairs on a cow. Maybe he could pee 3 or 4 of them. Although these fops were like dragons swimming in shallow water, not everyone could casually step on them. Su Dachang cast a glance at Su Kunshan, who had a great amount of qi, and the latter nodded confidently. The old man must have recognized that the 3 strangers' qi activity was ordinary, and they were not elites who could cause them to fail miserably. Su Dachang gained confidence. He twisted his butt and turned around with his chair. He said stiffly, "Get lost. I have already booked the 2nd floor." The young man, who looked more aristocratic than Qi Gumei, smiled and asked, "Is the Fish Dragons very impressive?" The young man was asking Lu Narong. He completely ignored the other 3. Su Dachang had a bad temper. He immediately stood up with a grin and picked up the knife on the table. The young man with the knife grinned and said, "Master, why don't I do it? And Wang Sheng, don't fight with me." Wang Sheng snorted. Su Kunshan's expression changed drastically. He quickly gave Qi Gumei a look. Qi Gumei stood up calmly and said gently, "Leader, I still have to rush to the Yaohua Lake to compete. I will take my leave first." Lu Narong was expressionless. Su Dachang was confused, but he still followed Qi Gumei and Su Kunshan downstairs. On the stairs, the 3 of them could clearly hear the young man with the knife and the young man with the sword tied to his waist complaining. "Blockhead Wang, sword energy is used to kill people, not to scare people. Didn't you alert the enemy? You made me lose 3 training dummies? No matter how broken they are still dummies. You have to pay." Master, you can be the judge. Su Fengyan ignored Lu Yunzhang. He looked through the window and saw the three people walking out of the building. Qi Gumei happened to look up. This young master didn't forget to smile gracefully. Su Fengyan ignored him. He sat at Lu Narong's table and said softly, "Let's not talk about asking Su Beiji for help. You could have at least talked to Fang Gaoqi of the Whispering Room. It wouldn't have ended up like this." Lu Narong didn't say anything. Su Fengyan took a clean cup from Wang Shang and poured himself a cup of wine. Lu Narong suddenly smiled, because for some reason, she remembered the scene of this fellow squatting by the well and haggling with the water ruffian back in Yanhui Pass. Chapter 1138. Lu Yunzhang was greatly disappointed with this trip to Longqing County. His immortal master had only freeloaded some wine with that woman and chatted about some trivial matters. There was not even the slightest bit of romance, let alone slaughter the shrimp soldiers and crab generals of the fish dragon gang. Before leaving, Lu Yunzhang had been rambling, saying that the female master of the 10th largest gang in the world had average looks and cultivation. In short, he was fighting for justice for his immortal master. The implication was that if it were him, he would not waste his energy on such a woman. Su Fengyan, who had never been willing to talk nonsense with Lu Yunzhang, spoke his mind for the first time. He said that he was not looking for a wife. It did not matter whether Lu Narong was beautiful or not. As for Lu Narong's martial arts aptitude, it did not affect whether she was a heroine in his heart. When Lu Yunzhang heard this, his eyes widened. Was Lu Narong worthy of being a heroine? Su Fengyan rewarded the youth with a four-word evaluation. It was like playing the lute to a cow. After that, the three of them rushed to Liangzhou. Along the way, Su Fengyan successively taught Wang Shang the rough embryonic form of over 10 sword moves. There were old Huang's 9 sword moves, the old man's 2 sword moves, and Wen Hua's 1 sword move. He allowed her to not ask for a deep understanding and only understood his intentions. He did not deliberately favor Wang Shang. The moves he taught Lu Yunzhang were all top-notch. He did not even hide Gu Jiantong's thunder core. This pair of youths could endure hardships and work hard. They secretly competed with each other, afraid of falling behind each other. When they practiced martial arts, they were obsessed with it. However, it was obvious that Lu Yunzhang's speed of cultivation was much faster than Wang Shang's. He was already very familiar with the hob and drag blade, and vaguely had the demeanor of a grandmaster. Occasionally, when he listened to Su Fengyan explain the profoundness of sword moves to Wang Shang, he would be able to comprehend by analogy. On the other hand, after Wang Shang acknowledged Su Fengyan as his master, for some reason, he became more and more introverted. He was silent and was no longer as naive and unaffected as before. Perhaps it was because of Lu Yunzhang's talent in martial arts that the girl felt a lot of speechless pressure. Su Fengyan was well aware of this, but he did not try to ease the heavy pressure in her heart because of this. As they neared Liangzhou, Su Fengyan rarely took the courier roads. He only chose the paths with few people and had Wang Shang and Lu Yunzhang take turns to fight. He wanted them to do their best to press forward with their weapons. Compared to the two, Lu Yunzhang was naturally more imposing. With the great frost blade in hand, he dared to fight with his life on the line. He would not even acknowledge the heavenly king. When facing his immortal master, he would never hold back and would always charge forward in a spurt of energy. Wang Shang, on the other hand, was much inferior. Every time he unsheathed Goose Yellow, even if his moves were 60 to 70% similar, his spirit was only 20 to 30%. This was exactly the opposite of Su Fengyan's expectations for her. Over time, Wang Shang also realized the crux of the problem. His originally dark and rough face became more and more stiff. Every time he looked at Su Fengyan's calm expression, he wanted to say something but hesitated. He felt guilty and uneasy. After crossing the Yellow Flower Pass, they would arrive at Liangzhou a dozen miles away. Currently, there were 14 military officers stationed in Beiliang's Taoist realm to guard the 14 passes. From the point to the line, it was proposed by Ancestor Gu, the originator of the situation theory. There was a flintlock for 5 miles, a block for 10 miles, a fort for 30 miles, and a city for 100 miles. In the past, Beiliang did not have flintlock forts. On the contrary, they were not shabby in number. However, most of them were disorderly. Once the real war broke out, they might not be able to quickly respond to each other. Now, the number was slightly reduced, but the situation in Bailiang suddenly became clear. The Yellow Flower Pass was one of the 14 passes. It was led by a senior military officer named Li Maozhen, who was an experienced military officer. Li Maozhen was old and wise and was deeply trusted by the old King Liang. Otherwise, Su Shao would not have let him guard the east gate of Liangzhou. The Huayuan Gate of this pass was the favorite of frontier poets of the past generations. This gate symbolized that the imperial court was conciliatory and farsighted. The dark green city walls that extended out from the two sides of the pass were like a dragon traversing the desert. The dragon's head extended to the north and connected to the red-shooting Wild Goose Mountain. At the top of the mountain was the Een-locking flintlock, which was known as the #1 flintlock in the world. In the past, the Yellow Flower Pass did not exclude people from fairs. Especially on the 1st and 15th of every month, people would come and go. It was unusually prosperous. However, after becoming one of the 14 passes, the Yellow Flower Pass became much more deserted. The trade caravans that passed through the northwest region of the dynasty had to take a detour. There were complaints everywhere. So much so that the weak military officer Li Maozhen sent a memorial to the Qingliang Mountain, requesting to reopen the city gate and military camp. The 3,000 elite soldiers would not need to be paid by Liangzhou and could even be used to support the border army. At that time, Su Fengyan was not in the palace. The Red Hanlin Academy in Wutongyan argued about this. In the end, Lu Chengyan, who replaced the Green Ants to enter Wutongyan, made the final decision and rejected the old military officer Li Maozhen's memorial. It was said that the old military officer Li Maozhen almost resigned and retired. He openly scolded the old military officer Wutongyan for not knowing the cost of living. He even said that they would empty out the palace sooner or later. The old military officer Li Maozhen didn't even let the young feudal lord off. 6 or 7 elite light cavalry galloped out of the Yellow Flower Pass gate, escorting a white-haired old man in casual clothes. The old man stopped his horse at a military camp outside the city and squatted on the ground, sighing. Although Bailiang Road imitated the court's Ministry of Works and established a military camp division to be in charge of all military camps and fields, the old man, who was familiar with the rules of officialdom, thought that this was just a helpless move by the new Prince Liang to settle down foreign scholars. The essence of a military camp was the 2 words, land reclamation. Once it was handed over to outsiders, it would only become a tool to make money. However, the old man was an official of Bailiang. How could he really go and wrestle with the Bailiang Palace? Fortunately, the young scholar in the military camp division with the official title of minister-counselor had not stretched his hands too far. Although he was not familiar with military affairs, his subordinates could be considered competent and dedicated. The new residents who had migrated from Bailiang Road's 4th prefecture, Liuzhou, were also well-behaved and peaceful. Only then did the old man pinch his nose and admit it. Otherwise, he really would have taken the bold action of driving them out of the country with troops. Not long after the old man arrived at the military camp, a few young civil officials rushed over upon hearing the news. Among them, the young man in the lead had an 8th-level embroidered official patch. The 2 behind him were 9th-level quails. Their ranks were not high, but they held real power. The 8th-level official was one of the 6 minister-counselors of Bailiang Road's military camp division. His name was Lu Gongren. The other 5 were all at the border. He was the only one in charge of the military camp matters in Liang and Yu prefectures. It was said that this was because the military camp division was wary of Li Maozhen, who was in the bag. Lu Gongren was implicated and had no choice but to remain within the borders. After Lu Gongren arrived here, other than surveying the fields, he had also paid a visit to the UG general's residence several times. Unfortunately, Li Maozhen, a military officer with real power, did not give this young man any face. Each time he was met with a closed door. After Bailiang Road's 14 military officers surfaced, it was like a military town. Most of them were new faces. At this time, the arrogant old man who was squatting by the field with his butt facing Lu Gongren was the backbone of Yellow Flower Pass, the weak military officer Li Maozhen. The old man did not pay attention to Lu Gongren's courteous words. He snorted coldly and did not even raise his head. He sneered, "Sir Lu, you really have the leisure to come here and worm your way into being friends with me. Are you not afraid of delaying the great undertaking of the military camp of 2 prefectures? Or do you think that being familiar with a weak military officer will be beneficial for your future climb in the bureaucracy?" Chapter 1139. When the 2 8th-rank counselor and assistant officials, who were as young as the main official, heard this, they were filled with righteous indignation. They were about to speak when Lu Gongren, whose mouth and tongue were parched, waved his hand. He took a few steps forward and was about to walk to the old man's side when a strong retainer blocked his path with a knife. Lu Gongren smiled. The retainer weighed the pros and cons in his mind. He probably felt that this 7th-rank civil official's eyes were clear and couldn't bring himself to hate him. After hesitating for a moment, he moved aside and allowed Lu Gongren to walk to the side of the field. He sat down next to the old man and shook the collar of his official robe. It turned out that this counselor was sweating profusely. There was dirt under his fingernails, and even his official patch was stained with dirt. Li Maozhen's discerning eyes allowed him to catch this flaw with just a glance. He clicked his tongue and said, "Sir Lu, you are a good official. Wearing your official robe to work in the field, who would think that you are incompetent? Or are you afraid that others won't recognize you as a 7th-rank official?" Lu Gongren smiled calmly and said, "Not only is it not cool to work in official robes, it is also cumbersome. However, if I don't wear official robes, I will be chased out of the field by your ferocious troops." Li Maozhen furrowed his brows and didn't make a sound. At this moment, the retainers who had followed Li Maozhen out of the city were somewhat wary. 3 strange people slowly walked over from the side of the field. When the 2 sides were about 10 meters apart, the empty-handed young man smiled and asked, "Are you Li Maozhen?" Li Maozhen, who had been called directly by his name, turned his head and looked at the somewhat familiar face. His heart was in turmoil, but he wasn't sure. Li Maozhen was a veteran of Beiliang and naturally remembered the peerless beauty of Beiliang's Wu Wangfei. However, how could the old man believe that the young man in front of him was that him? The young man with 2 youths with swords and knives on his back smiled and said, "Li Maozhen, standing in front of you, you don't curse?" Hearing this ridicule, how could Li Maozhen not recognize this person's identity? He abruptly stood up and was about to kneel in greeting. However, at some point, the scholarly-looking young man had walked over to Li Maozhen's side. He and Minister Counselor Lu Gongren sat on the old man's left and right. Li Maozhen's light cavalry retainers were all startled. Just as they were about to protect the old man, Li Maozhen ordered them to retreat and return to the city. Lu Gongren and the 2 assistant officers of the Army Garrison Division, who had been standing all this time, were somewhat at a loss. Li Maozhen was so excited that he did not know what to say. The old man was not really stupid. If the king of Beiliang really sat next to him, he would not dare to scold him even if he had 10 times the courage of a bear's heart and leopard's guts. Moreover, when his memorial was refuted, he only said a few words out of anger. He regretted it afterwards. In fact, at that time, if the young king of Beiliang wrote it himself instead of those women in Wutangen, then let alone refuting it, even if the king of Beiliang scolded Li Maozhen to his face, he, as a weak military officer, would not talk back. Li Maozhen, who held great power in his hands, recognized 2 things more than many people. One was Beiliang and the other was the Su family. It did not matter if you were a kitten, a dog, or the head of the Su family after great General Su Shao. As long as you sat in the position of the Lord of Beiliang, Li Maozhen would serve you to the death. The person who came was naturally Su Fengnian. He leaned around Li Maozhen and looked at the 8th-rank official Lu Gongren. He smiled and said, "You should be the Minister Counselor Lu who once studied at Shangyin Academy. You can continue talking. I'll just listen." Lu Gongren mistakenly thought that this was a local snake that even old General Li was afraid of, and that he was the son of a general with a strong background in Liangzhou. However, since he was here, he might as well take the opportunity to explain to the old military officer why Beiliang wanted to draw legs on a snake and set up the military field department. However, before the young civil official could speak, Li Maozhen turned his head and glared at him fiercely. The king is sitting next to you and is personally supporting you. What nonsense are you talking to this old man about? In the future, I will strictly control those subordinates who deliberately make things difficult for the military field department. If you, as the minister-counselor, have any difficulties, you can directly enter the UG general's mansion in the pass. Lu Gongren and the two young officials behind him were stunned. Su Fengyan raised his head and waved his hand. He smiled and said, "Sit down and talk." They sat side by side on the side of the field. Other than Li Maozhen, who was able to maintain a calm expression on his face, the others, including Lu Gongren, were all restless and had an uncontrollable excitement in their chests. In the cultivation of the government, one rank followed another, and the threshold followed the threshold. There was almost no end to it. For the 6 ministers who were the pillars of the imperial court, not to mention the officials from other places, even the officials from the capital who could participate in the court assembly might not be able to get in front of these important figures in their entire lives, much less speak a few words with them. However, other than the Grand Secretary Zhang Julu and Gu Jiantang, the vassal kings who had divided the territory were undoubtedly rarer than these pillars of the dynasty. These scholars who had gone to Liang had long heard of the various deeds of the new Liang prince. He was different from the notorious reputation of the past. The rumors that were becoming more and more intense were mostly the heroic deeds of the young vassal kings. However, even if Su Fengyan was an embroidered pillow that could not be supported, as long as he was the master of Beiliang, then he was destined to have a large group of famous heroes on the battlefield, such as Chu Lushan, Yuan Zuozong, and Yan Wenluan standing behind him. Su Fengyan saw that they were not willing to speak, so he could only smile and ask, "Official Lu, how many roads have you traveled since you became the minister-counselor?" Lu Gongren said respectfully, "I have been the minister-counselor of the army division for more than 2 months. I don't know how many roads I have traveled, but I have already changed 4 pairs of boots." Li Maozhen said softly, "Lu Gongren, this 8th-level official, is not quite the same as the previous pests in Beiliang. I have investigated his background. Since he took office, he has not bought a private residence or kept a servant. However, I can't rule out the possibility that he is not familiar with the network of officialdom and did not dare to enter the water too early and ruin his future." Lu Gongren did not know whether to laugh or cry. He said in a muffled voice, "Old General Li, are you saying good or bad things?" Su Fengyan said, "With Li Maozhen's bad temper, generally speaking, if he did not directly say bad things about you, then it is considered good things." Li Maozhen smiled softly and nodded. His expression was somewhat self-satisfied. Su Fengyan suddenly addressed him as Old General Li and asked, "Lu Gongren and the other scholars who have just taken up their posts, are they satisfactory?" Li Maozhen grunted and said, "At the very least, within 3 or 4 years, they can be considered honest officials. As for whether they can be called capable officials, compared to those who squatted in the latrine pit and did not shit, they are certainly much better." Su Fengyan said to himself, "This is enough." Li Maozhen suddenly asked carefully, "Your Highness, why don't we switch places? I do not dare to sit in the middle of the main seat. I feel that Your Highness is trying to use peaceful means before resorting to force. Are you going to remove my official hat?" Su Fengyan joked. "Su Xiao said before that you, Li Maozhen, are addicted to being an official, which is why he made an exception and asked the Liang Imperial Court for you to be a 4-man guerrilla general. Now it seems that this is indeed the case." Li Maozhen laughed out loud and said, "If I am not an official, how can I lead troops into battle? I know my own weight, otherwise I would have asked Your Highness for the position of Grand Commander." Su Fengyan said softly, "There will be a lot of fighting coming up." Li Maozhen was stunned for a moment before he smiled knowingly. According to our old rules, every time there is a big battle, the Su family cavalry must set up 2 temporary vanguard battalions. Why don't you count Li Maozhen in? In any case, the Grand General has promised me that the title of Guerrilla General can be inherited. This old man has no other wishes. The eldest son of the Su family, Li Hosher, is not inferior to me in leading troops. Leaving Yellow Flower Pass to him, Your Highness can be at ease." Su Fengyan smiled and said, "Su Xiao is already dying of old age in his bed. You, Li Maozhen, have 4 generations under the same roof. What are you going to do at the border? Li Maozhen said in a low voice. Then let's treat it as one last time helping the Grand General fight at the border. Military advisor Li Yishan once said that we must always let those northern barbarians remember one thing. Where the Su family's gate is where the gate of Liang is. Chapter 1140. Su Fengyan originally wanted to say goodbye and go around the Yellow Flower Pass to enter Liangzhou, but Li Maozhen would not let him go. He kept pestering him until he entered the Yu general's residence. Even Lu Gongren and the others could not escape. A large banquet was held in the residence. Li Maozhen called his eldest son, Li Hosher. The old officer did not dare to make the new King Liang drink, but he was not polite to Lu Gongren. Li Maozhen was an old wine worm who had been soaked in the wine jar of officialdom. He was very good at drinking, persuading, and avoiding alcohol. The young talents of the military field department wanted to stay sober in front of the young king, but they quickly drank until they collapsed. Lu Gongren was drunk and sang a song. It was Yu Luandao's Liangzhou de Ma. The banquet ended happily. Li Maozhen was also drunk. He could only let Li Hosher help Su Fengyan out of the Yellow Flower Pass. When they left the residence, there was a handsome young man in a scholarly robe sneakily following behind them. Li Hosher, who was in the prime of his life, had a helpless expression. He explained to Su Fengyan that the young man was his youngest son, Li Jingfu. He had become a shotsai at the age of 11. However, this child greatly admired the number 1 king of Beiliang. Su Fengyan praised him from the bottom of his heart. Li Jingfu could be considered a rare scholar in Beiliang. Li Hosher's appearance was similar to his father, Li Maozhen. However, he did not have a strong official aura. In the evening, according to the records of the Fu Shui chamber, this Yellow Flower Pass cavalry captain who had been in charge of the Yin Suayin Guard for 8 years walked with Su Fengyan on the deserted street. The young man, Li Jingfu, saw that the king of Beiliang and his father did not reprimand him for not knowing the rules. He tiptoed behind the 4 of them. He looked enviously at Lu Yunzhang, who was carrying a blade, and Wang Shang, who was carrying a case. Li Hosher hesitated and said softly, "Your Highness, my father does have selfish motives. He wants me to take over the Yellow Flower Pass. Father has always said that even if I can inherit the title of Yu General, it is meaningless. I hope your Highness does not mind." At this point, Li Hosher, who was not good with words, blushed and smiled. He probably did not know how to continue. Su Fengyan smiled indifferently. "Your father's addiction to being an official is not small. This banquet is also to pave the way for you. It's good that you leave an impression in the prince's mansion of Mount Qingliang. In the future, it will be easier for you to be promoted. However, you still underestimate your father too much. Before your father entered the city, he made a bet with me. If, after I saw you, I felt that you could shoulder the heavy responsibility of guarding Huanghua Pass, then I would allow him to serve as an old soldier in either of the vanguard and breaking enemy battalions. If you want to put it this way, your future Ruoshui commandant was exchanged with your father's life today." Li Hosher's face turned red. After holding back for a long time, he finally said, "Your Highness, don't listen to my father. This old man is already so old. He can still ride a horse in casual clothes, but if he wears armor and holds a spear, he won't be able to last an incense stick of time." Su Fengyan nodded his head. Li Hosher continued, "Your Highness, our Li family's bloodline is still flourishing. I still have 2 younger brothers who are in the military. The family business of Huanghua Pass is not lacking in successors. My father's wish should be fulfilled by me, the eldest son of the first wife." Su Fengyan didn't comment. He turned his head and saw Lu Yunzhang hugging the Confucian-robed youth's shoulder and whispering to him. It was most likely Lu Yunzhang, that sly little rascal, showing off his shrewdness in worldly affairs. Li Jingfu waited for the vassal king to turn his head. He lowered his body and broke free from Lu Yunzhang's arm. He mustered his courage and took a few steps forward. Just as he was about to speak, he was glared at by Li Hosher. "Don't push your luck. Go back and read your book." The youth's voice trembled slightly as he said in a clear voice, I am a scholar. Instead of writing my name down in history, it's better to hang my head at the gate of the country." As soon as these words came out, the already deserted street became even more silent. Li Hosher was a rough man who was used to using a bow and spear, but rarely used a pen. Wang Shang and Lu Yunzhang were even worse. They only felt that this person of the same age spoke in a scholarly manner. Su Fengyan raised his hand and motioned Li Hosher not to make a sound. He said with a smile, "Kid, you are still young, but your tone is not small. I have seen Huang Longsher, Chao Chongqing, and Shenyuan Jingqing. These three people are the Confucian sages among the land immortals." Hearing this, in just a short sentence, three thunderous names appeared. The young Li Jingfu's eyes shone brightly as he stared at the great hero in his heart. He thought that the king of Beiliang, who had traveled thousands of miles, had seen the world more than anyone else. Su Fengyan continued, "But they didn't speak as if they could swallow mountains and rivers like you." Li Hosher couldn't help but chuckle. However, when he saw his young son's pale face, he sighed quietly. Su Fengyan seemed to be talking to himself. The name of a scholar goes down in history, while the head of a military official hangs at the gate of the country. They don't interfere with each other. If the former can write more good things about the latter when they are behind closed doors writing beautiful articles, that would be very good. Su Fengyan looked at Li Jingfu and said, "I'm not laughing at you for overestimating yourself. A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. When I practiced the saber back then, I also harbored great ambitions. At that time, no one thought highly of me. When one's heart is moved, one's intention will be born. The reason why I'm telling you this is because I feel that you are still too young. Even if you throw away your pen and join the army, you will only be a burden to others on the battlefield. Besides, Beiliang has 300,000 cavalry that are the most powerful in the world. How can a young scholar like you cut off your head and study?" After saying this, Su Fengyan told Li Hosher that there was no need to send him off. He took his two disciples and walked straight out of Yellow Flower Pass. After a long time, Li Jingfu came back to his senses. He pinched his cheeks and laughed foolishly. "Prince Liang talked to me?" Li Hosher, who always felt that the older the child got, the more difficult it would be to talk to him. He laughed softly and said, "Silly boy." Li Jingfu happily walked toward the Yu-Ji general's residence. Li Hosher silently followed behind him. Looking at his son's still slender figure, he felt somewhat proud. Li Jingfu suddenly turned his head and asked, "Father, do you want to go to the Jade Wall restaurant to drink?" Li Hosher was taken aback, then said, "I can still drink a caddy of 8 taels." Li Jingfu grinned and said, "Then I'll treat you to a drink." Li Hosher was confused. Li Jingfu blinked and walked next to Li Hosher. He said quietly, "This year, I went out of the city for a walk and saw a girl. Her father is the shopkeeper of the Jade Wall restaurant. Every time I am tired from studying, I will go there. Just looking at her and not thinking about anything else, I feel refreshed." Li Hosher roared with laughter. The corners of Li Jingfu's mouth curled up slightly. He purposely said bitterly, "But that girl likes a street wanderer who is not in the pass right now." Li Hosher rubbed his young son's head, not knowing how to comfort him. Li Jingfu looked up and said with a smile, "Father, I want to learn from Zhao Chongling and Li Yishan, the 2 Beiliang strategists. In the future, when I am successful, I will give Prince Liang advice and strategize from thousands of miles away." Li Hosher made a sound of acknowledgement. The father and son walked together to the restaurant 2 streets away. Li Hosher said softly, "Since you have a girl you like in your heart, and you also have ambitions, your grandfather won't let you drink, but your father will let you drink." 2 hours later, the commandant of Yellow Flower Pass, Li Hosher, walked out of the restaurant with his drunk young son on his back. The rough man had a warm expression. As he walked, the commandant's gaze gradually became determined. If he wanted to study, he should study. But there was one thing that the vassal king had said. Beiliang had 300,000 cavalry. Only if everyone, including Li Hosher, lost their heads would it be the people's turn. Didn't the Beimang claim to have 1 million people controlling the strings? Even if they took down Bailiang, would there be tens of thousands left? The youth on his back murmured drunkenly, "Father, I will study hard and become a Confucian saint. I will not be afraid of walking the narrow path, but will pave a bright path for the people of the world." Li Hosher smiled and said, "You are so reasonable even when drunk. You are better than father." Chapter 1141. Since the first year of Xiangfu, the night curfew in Liangzhou City had become extremely strict. However, when Su Fengyan arrived at the city gate, there was already a group of elite spies waiting for him. The gate slowly opened, and Wang Shang could clearly see the faces of the armored soldiers under the light of the city gate. Regardless of whether they had experienced the vicissitudes of life or immaturity, they were all brimming with a contradictory aura that made her feel unfamiliar. They were hot because of reverence, and cold because of bravery. The simple-minded Lu Yunzhang did not feel much, but he keenly felt that these armored soldiers were taller and stronger than the light cavalry soldiers he had encountered along the way. They were also more dangerous. In comparison, one was like a noisy chicken or duck waiting for its owner to feed it every day, while the other was like a wild dog digging for its own food in the wilderness. It did not like to bark, but it could really bite people to death. For this pair of extremely lucky young men and women, the title of King of Bailiang was too far out of their reach. It was far less approachable than the tranquil demeanor of their immortal master. However, Lu Yunzhang soon had the most direct impression. When the young man saw the two jade stone lions as tall as two people at the gate of the king's mansion on Mount Qingliang, he was extremely shocked. He quickly trotted under one of the lions and reached out to touch the cool and huge lion claws. He clicked his tongue in wonder and chattered endlessly. One moment, he said that it was too damn imposing and that no family in the martial emperor city had such a facade. Another moment, he speculated about how much money it would fetch if he stole it and sold it. The king of Bailiang returned home after a long journey, but there was not much movement in the mansion. A middle-aged housekeeper came out to symbolically lead the way into the mansion. The housekeeper walked behind Su Fengyan and whispered to him. The two bumpkins, Wang Shang and Lu Yunzhang, stared with their eyes wide open. It was too much for their eyes to take in. The two children stared at each other for a long time and did not show any signs of stopping. Only then did they reluctantly blink their sore eyes. They looked at each other and smiled, seeing each other's uneasiness. The two children, who were always at loggerheads with each other, finally had some tacit understanding. Lu Yunzhang felt as though he had walked into a fairyland. The sisters were all like immortal sisters who had walked out from the murals of temples. Their clothes were extravagant, and their auras were indescribable to an uneducated youth. Any one of them could easily beat Xiao Mei, who liked to put on thick rouge in the neighboring alley of the martial emperor city, by more than 18 streets. Lu Yunzhang was at the back of the group. He even turned his head to look at a young woman in a distant corridor. Her figure was graceful, and even from afar, one would find it hard to shift their eyes away from her. She walked leisurely under a large white lantern. When she suddenly turned her head, her eyes happened to meet his. She gave him a sweet smile that nearly hooked Lu Yunzhang's soul away. Lu Yunzhang retracted his gaze and shook his head. He smiled embarrassedly, thinking that this sister was really charming. Wang Shang, who was walking slightly in front, suddenly had her vision open up. She stopped in her tracks. Even when Lu Yunzhang bumped into her from behind, she did not take a step forward. Lu Yunzhang turned his body sideways, his mind swaying. Right in front of them was the famous Tidehark Lake. The two new disciples of Su Fengyan had completely different reactions when they saw Tidehark Lake. The lofty and ambitious Lu Yunzhang immediately looked up at the pavilion. The Tidehark Pavilion on Tidehark Lake contained tens of thousands of manuals. Just one of them was enough to dominate an area. Lu Yunzhang did not believe it in the past, but after he witnessed his master's artifact controlling skills outside Martial Emperor City, he was convinced. Wang Shang, on the other hand, lowered her head and gazed into the distance. She looked at the calm surface of the water that was illuminated by the lakeside lanterns. She wanted to know if there really was a heavenly lake koi that weighed 10 jin of gold there. There was a pavilion in the middle of the lake, and in the pavilion stood a skinny shepherd boy who looked lonely and timid. For some reason, Wang Shang and Lu Yunzhang looked up and down at the same time. They saw the rather unremarkable child who was about 4 or 5 years younger than them. The three children had a tacit understanding as they looked at each other. Su Fengyan had already gotten the housekeeper to do his own things. He looked at the child in the pavilion and smiled. His name is Yu Dilong. He is your eldest senior brother. The corner of Lu Yunzhang's mouth twitched as he flaunted his seniority. What? This child is the senior brother of Wang Mutu and I? Dilong? The name sounds domineering, but he looks so skinny that he doesn't even have a few kilograms of strength. I don't think he can even carry my saber. Wang Shang said softly, Dilong are earthworms in my hometown. They can be used as medicine. Su Fengyan nodded and said, That is true. A figure suddenly appeared in front of the three of them. It was neither tall nor short. Lu Yunzhang was a little surprised. It was actually a guy in a wheelchair. However, not only Lu Yunzhang who was good at reading people's expressions, but even Wang Shang sensed that their immortal master seemed to have bumped into an immortal who was 100 times more powerful than him. He was so nervous that his footsteps were a little out of shape. Lu Yunzhang whispered, Could it be a peerless expert from Bailiang Palace who never appeared in the world? Su Fengyan quickly walked to the embankment of the lake and helped push the wooden wheelchair. He pursed his lips and didn't speak. Lu Yunzhang was probably afraid of the young woman in the wheelchair. The youth didn't dare to smile at all. On the contrary, Wang Shang spontaneously had feelings of intimacy when he saw her. The woman did not open her mouth to speak to Su Fengyan. Instead, she turned her chair and looked at the two children. In the end, her gaze rested on Wang Shang, who was carrying a case and a sword. She smiled and said, It's a sword embryo. If your master's mother and I were to see it, we would definitely be very happy. Wang Shang was shy and didn't know how to answer, but when she felt the kindness of her elder sister, the tall girl could only smile. Her originally rough and vulgar appearance instantly became like the mist of the distant mountains, green mountains and clear waters. Chapter 1142. Lu Yunzhang also didn't treat himself as an outsider. He could see that the woman with a high status didn't have a good impression of him. He didn't dare to draw legs on a snake, so he sneakily ran to the pavilion to find trouble with the little brat. Although the youth was unconvinced of Wang Shang's senior apprentice brother status, Wang Mutu had the advantage of entering the sect early. Lu Yunzhang was actually bored to death and only wanted to quarrel with others to vent his anger. He didn't really care about the senior apprentice brother or second junior apprentice brother. The youth knew that as long as his fists were hard enough, his ability was big enough, and his blade was fast enough, these were the most solid principles in the world. But who was the fellow in the pavilion? How could he be ranked ahead of him and Wang Shang? The moment Lu Yunzhang entered the pavilion, he slammed the great frost saber that was still in its scabbard on the ground. With a black face, he asked in a deep voice, Earthworm you? Do you dare eat my saber? The little shepherd boy, who had been left alone by Su Yanbing after being brought to Mount Qingliang, was still living in a fog. He did not know anything, but he knew one thing. This was the home of the king of Bailiang, and his master was the person whose words carried the most weight in Bailiang. At this moment, he was being questioned by a stranger who was a head taller than him. He was at a loss. Who was Earthworm you calling? Why did he want to eat a saber the moment they met? Lu Yunzhang, who did not like to bully the weak, quickly became dispirited. Turned out that he was just an ignorant little fool. To think that he had even planned to use his trump card, the rolling blade divine technique. Lu Yunzhang said with a straight face, In the future, I will only call you senior brother in front of master, but every time I call you that, you have to call me big brother in private. Lu Yunzhang quickly added, And you have to call Wang Mutu's second brother. Do you see him? He's that tall and strong guy by the lake. I use a saber and he uses a sword. Lu Yunzhang said this and asked curiously, What weapon do you use? The little shepherd boy had obtained the nickname of Earthworm Yu and two elder brothers for no reason. He was momentarily stunned. After hearing Lu Yunzhang's question, he glanced enviously at the saber in the youth's hand. He shook his head and said, I don't have anything. Lu Yunzhang's eyes quickly turned. Your father is a high-ranking official in Beiliang? Yu Dilong shook his head vigorously. Lu Yunzhang pressed. Then, is your father the founder of some pugilistic sect in Beiliang? After Yu Dilong subconsciously shook his head, he asked in a low voice, What is the founder? Lu Yunzhang sat on a bench and slapped his forehead. F***ck. A chicken talking to a duck. To have such a senior brother. He really had 8 lifetimes of bad luck and made a fool of himself. How am I going to survive in Jianghu in the future? Yu Dilong didn't really talk to anyone in the northern Liang prince's mansion. Although this robust young man looked fierce, Yu Dilong was still a child. He liked to be lively. He carefully sat beside Lu Yunzhang and stared at the large frost saber. He muttered to himself, You only took 1 item, but it's as thick as my thigh. I counted the items by the lake. There were 15 items, but each of them was as thin as a pinky finger. You look more impressive. Lu Yunzhang pretended to be fierce and asked, What thick thighs and thin pinkies? Are you out of your mind? Yu Dilong pointed at Lu Yunzhang's frost saber and said with an aggrieved look, Isn't there a white gas on your saber? Can't you see it? Lu Yunzhang's face was calm, but his heart was in turmoil. He was shocked and pleasantly surprised. He was shocked that if the child wasn't spouting nonsense, then his eyesight wasn't tacky. He was pleasantly surprised that he had gone further than Wang Mutu on the path of martial arts. Lu Yunzhang suddenly stared at this junior-senior brother of strange origins and asked, What about you? Do you have that kind of qi? Yu Dilong chuckled and did not say a word. Lu Yunzhang rolled his eyes and said, So you aren't stupid. Wang Shang walked into the pavilion and saw that Lu Yunzhang and the shepherd boy had already become friends. He could not help but feel envious and disappointed. Yu Dilong struggled for a long time as he scratched his ears and cheeks. He finally mustered the courage to say, Junior sister? He probably felt that it was inappropriate to address an older sister on their first meeting. So he probed, Why don't I call you senior sister? Having his identity exposed, Wang Shang was slightly angered. Sword Qi immediately appeared in the pavilion. Yu Dilong did not seem to notice it as he scratched his head. He did not know what he had done wrong and felt apologetic. Lu Yunzhang exclaimed, I must be blind with my dog eyes. I was wondering why you, Mutu Wang, would wish to run 7 to 8 miles just to pee. So you are just a little woman? Wang Shang said angrily, Since you are blind with your dog eyes, then shut your dog mouth. Lu Yunzhang suddenly stood up. Mutu Wang, don't push your luck. Are you looking for a beating? Although Yu Dilong was the youngest, he hurriedly tried to mediate. He anxiously said, Don't hit. Don't hit. If you really want to hit me. Lu Yunzhang could not help but roll his eyes. You sure are righteous. Wang Shang smiled and cupped his fists. Senior brother. Yu Dilong was at a loss as he could only grin foolishly. By the lake, Su Weisheng retracted his gaze and ignored the 3 children playing in the pavilion. He said with a sigh, Is this the providence of the pugilistic world you inherited from Wang Xianji? Su Fengyan nodded and said, That should be the case. Otherwise, how could you find 3 children with such outstanding talent at once? Lu Yunzhang has a martial aura, so he was able to obtain the recognition of the great frost saber. Wang Shang is a natural sword embryo that only appears once in 100 years. As for Lu Long, he obtained 30% of Wang Xianji's legacy. These 3 disciples of mine will probably have a place in the top 10 experts of the pugilistic world in the future. If this were to spread, it would be so good. Even Wang Xianji couldn't do this when she was still alive. Look, not only did I defeat Wang Xianji, even my disciple is more promising than this old fellow. Su Weisheng looked up at his brother and said calmly, Look at how happy you are. Quickly close your mouth. Be careful not to crack it behind your ears. Su Fengyan squatted beside her and asked nervously, Sis, aren't you angry? When I went to Wudong Mountain to practice my saber skills, you were unwilling to talk to me when I returned home. Later on, when we went to Beimang, you almost didn't acknowledge me as your brother. Su Weisheng placed his hands on his knees and looked at the calm lake. His eyes were warm and gentle as he said, Back then, Dad was in charge. You were fooling around. Now, you are in charge and shouldering the burden. Su Fengnian acknowledged and rubbed his cheeks with both hands. Don't worry. I won't have the time to mess around in the pugilistic world. I'm about to make a trip to the border, unlike the previous review. This time, I'm going to call all 14 lieutenants. It can be said that the 50 or so generals who hold real power in Beiliang will all be meeting together. Su Weisheng turned his head and flicked Su Fengnian's head. You're still showing off. Su Fengnian smiled helplessly and did not refute. Su Weisheng tapped the edge of the chair with one hand and propped up his chin with the other. He smiled brightly and said proudly, "The entire pugilistic world is watching you. In the future, the two countries will also have to obey your whims. Regardless of success or failure, how many people can there be in 1,000 years?" Su Fengnian only glanced at the sky. Chapter 1143. In the darkness of the night, Su Fengnian walked alone to the yellow crane tower on Mount Qingliang. The spring festival couplets on a white background were still pasted on the gate of the mansion, and the lanterns in the mansion were all white as snow. After the death of the old man, this solemn mansion was no longer joyous. It was not until the whole of Beiliang learned that the young vassal state had defeated Wang Xianji of the martial emperor city that the atmosphere of Mount Qingliang took a big turn. Many of the thoughts that had been hanging on the tip of their tongues were suddenly put to rest, and the haze that had shrouded Beiliang Palace was swept away. After Su Fengnian entered the mansion, he did not go to the Wutong Inn where he had spent his youth. Instead, he went to Su Zhao's house and sat there for a long time. The two standing clothes racks still held the old-style boa robe of Prince Liang and the model general's armor. Outsiders would think that it was reasonable for Su Zhao to care about the latter. After all, Su Zhao, the lone thief, had climbed to the top of the court by virtue of his military exploits. However, few people knew that the butcher actually did not scoff at the vassal state's robe as outsiders mistakenly thought. Su Fengnian was well aware of this. What Su Zhao cared about was not the vassal state's identity as the vassal state's king, but the credit behind it. It was the credit of rebuilding the Zhao dynasty that many powerful officials in the imperial court had deliberately forgotten. At that time, Liang was just a barbarian dynasty in the northern region. Heroes rose together and the vassal state was divided. Who in the central plains, including De Chu, would treat this guy who had endless internal strife as a formidable opponent? It was precisely because Su Zhao, the troublemaker, went south to Liao that he forcefully helped the late emperor of Liang hold the dynasty in his hands. Without internal strife, he laid the foundation for the subsequent spring and autumn period. This was also the reason why many of the nobles of the Zhao dynasty had a clear distinction between their love and hate for Su Zhao. Most of the older members of the imperial family who were close to the late emperor were in the dark currents of the imperial court after the world was settled. Even if they did not speak up for Su Zhao, at the very least, they would not hit him when he was down. However, most of the older members of the imperial family had suffered major and minor injuries on the battlefield, so they died earlier than some of the clan relatives who were lying down and enjoying life. Moreover, most of their descendants did not get along well with the current emperor and the ruling Bai Yan, so they could not stand out. In addition, there were long-standing and serious disagreements within the imperial family. This group of nominal descendants could be said to be struggling at death's door. As a result, they did not have a share in this southern expedition to West Chu. Most of it was another group of young nobles who swaggered south with a few old generals to seize the credit. In any case, their parents and ancestors had relied on this kind of trick to climb up. This was probably the origin of their family's knowledge. Practice makes perfect. Su Fengnian walked slowly on the mountain path and then stopped halfway up the mountain to look at Liangzhou. The lights in Liangzhou were dim. One part of the city was extinguished, while other parts of the city were lit up. It was peaceful and serene. Su Fengnian turned and continued to climb the mountain. In the days he had been rushing back to Beiliang, the Whispering Room had been sending him concise intelligence reports. Other than Lu Shengxiang, who had failed to seize power but still held the position of Assistant Minister of the Ministry of War, stationed at Yalu Pass, there was also a vast group led by Yang Shenxing and Yan Jinchuan, who had meritorious service during the spring and autumn period. They had formed 3 alls with Yalu Pass, pointing directly at West Chu. They had coordinated with the various vassals of Jingnan and the crown princes of vassals like Zhao Zhu, forming a seemingly watertight encirclement around West Chu. Su Fengyan smiled coldly. Other than the trick of killing the rooster as a warning to the monkeys, how could the Zhao family not have the filthy idea of bringing trouble to the king of Yanqi? On the eastern front, there was the king of Guangling Zhao Yi. On the western front, there was the king of Huainan Zhao Ying and the king of Jing and Zhao Sun. Even if they ate these two, the West Chu could not take advantage of the situation and head west. In the northwest of the dynasty, there was the Bailiang cavalry. In the west, there was the old western Shu where Chun Jibao was a vassal. Since ancient times, the road to Shu was as difficult as ascending to the blue sky. In the south, there was the king of Yanqi Zhaobing. This was the second, more hidden and tighter encirclement. However, in the south, there was only the sloppy Zhao Zhu who led a small number of cavalry. Moreover, the south was especially vast. Under the premise that the West Chu could not go north, they could only spread south to have a chance of survival. Among the vassal kings, the one with real military power, Zhao Yi, was the brother of the current emperor. He was in Guangling, so there was no need for the one sitting on the dragon throne to scheme too much. Bailiang had Beimang to the north and western Shu to the south. It was equivalent to being suppressed. In the end, only Zhao Bing was left to be dealt with. In the past, there was Su Shao to take the blame, so the court naturally prioritized Bailiang. Now that Su Shao had left, it was naturally Zhao Bing, who was high up in the sky and far away from the emperor. In addition, a new secret letter from Tai and City said that after Zhang Julu's opinion was rejected, he settled for the next best thing. He proposed a new strategy of using West Chu to train the troops and take back military power. Almost even Gu Jiantang, who had voluntarily abandoned Gu Lu, was ruthlessly tricked. As long as there was a sign of resistance to the restrictions of the court's Ministry of War, they were all openly and covertly sent to the periphery of West Chu. Once the battle reached a stalemate, they would immediately enter the battlefield. Thousands of deaths were counted. Gu Lu, who had taught all over the world, was naturally the first to bear the brunt. Swaying in the wind and rain, Gu Lu was already on the verge of collapse. Zhang Julu clearly still did not want to let it go. If Gu Jiantang was still in the capital and personally presiding over the court's military affairs in the Ministry of War, perhaps there would be some countermeasures to this decree. However, Gu Jiantang already held the title of pillar of the country and led the military affairs of the northern land. Zhang Julu, intentionally or otherwise, dug a hole for the only remaining general of the four great generals of the spring and autumn period. He spoke up for him in the court and said with certainty that only Gu Jiantang personally led the troops down south could pacify the rebels in West Chu. He practically elevated the old minister of war to the lofty position of one person in charge of a country. In this way, Gu Jiantang, who had suffered an unexpected calamity, was already bold if he did not submit a secret memorial to ask for forgiveness. How would he dare to plead for leniency for the descendants of Gu Lu? This was also by Yen Er's consistent overt scheme. From beginning to end, it was for the sake of the country and the people, without the slightest bit of selfishness. Zhang Julu's balancing technique was pervasive. He cut off the struggles between civil and military officials, the early struggles between the foreign relatives and internal officials, the revived struggles between various factions, and even the struggles between factions of friends. Bai Yen had always remained calm and collected, taking a leisurely stroll in the courtyard. If Wang Xianji could be said to be undefeated in martial arts, then Zhang Julu could be said to be even more shrewd and ruthless, undefeated in literature. For example, the Ministry of Personnel, the head of the 6 ministries, had been tossed back and forth between Yu Lian and Zhao Yuling, who had betrayed Zhang Julu several times. Looking at the flowers in the fog outside, the palace hall looked like child's play. But inside, it was nothing more than a matter of Zhang Julu's word. Under his watch, whoever did something that crossed the line would have to obediently pack up and get lost. If one were to say that Zhao Yuling was Bai Yen's disciple, he was naturally lacking in confidence. But one must know that the old head of the Yu family in Jiangxin, Yu Jiankong, who was Yu Lian's father, was a big shot of the same school as Zhang Julu's benevolent teacher and West Chu's son Shiji's teacher. He was a master who evaluated the ranking of the clans under heaven, and was also the instigator of Hongjia's escape to the north. The old fellow only needed to play down the word up, and the clan would be like a carp leaping over the dragon gate. If the word down, it would mean that the entire clan would fall into the dust together. The entire group of Jiangnan scholars, including Lu Daolin and Lu Baijie, including the Lu family, as well as the dragon general Su Gong of the Gumusu family, all had to follow this person's lead. But after so many years, Zhang Julu still did not give the old man the slightest bit of face. Su Fengyan unwittingly walked to the top of the mountain. There were stone tables and stone stools downstairs, and then he saw an unexpected fellow. He borrowed the white fox's face from the spring thunder embroidered winter, but he did not say anything after that. Su Fengyan sat opposite him. There was a large pile of green ant wine jugs on the table, and there were even 2 wine cups. It was obvious that he was waiting for him. White Fox's face was slightly sarcastic. First pin 4 realms. You've collected all 4 false realms. It's definitely unprecedented. This is even more admirable than you killing Wang Xianji. Su Fengyan laughed. It's worth it to be able to make you admire me. White Fox's face poured him a cup of wine for the first time. He pushed the wine cup forward and asked, have you ever thought that when Huang Longshi stirred up the Jianghu, in the end, he used Han Shangxian and you to end it? Why don't you count the number of first pin masters who died in the hands of Catman and you? Don't add up to 20? How many first pin masters can there be in any generation of Jianghu for 100 years? At most, there should only be this number, right? Su Fengyan raised his wine cup and laughed at himself. He then finished it in one gulp. When he reached out to ask for more wine, he shook his head and said, I really didn't think about this. White Fox's face threw him a wine jug and said, I promised Mr. Li that I would help you once. You killed Wang Xianji, who was on my enemies list. This means that I, Nangong Puji, owe you twice. But I'll say this first. After I finish reading on the last floor of Tide Listening Pavilion, I'll go to Beimang first. If I can come back alive, this promise will only be valid. Su Fengyan asked, Are you looking for trouble with Tuoba Bodhisattva? White Fox's face nodded. Su Fengyan lamented, Wang Xianji and Tuoba Bodhisattva. How much hatred do they have? You're just a woman. White Fox's face was cold as she interrupted. I'm a man. Su Fengyan dismissed it with a laugh. It was unreasonable to reason with a woman. However, White Fox's face was probably really treating him as a man. Or maybe he was really a man, just like the androgynous Murong Tonghuang who had fled to Beimang. White Fox's face lifted his head and drank a big gulp of wine. He joked, If you were a woman, I would really marry you. Su Fengyan was speechless. White Fox's face suddenly said, When I was practicing martial arts, I always felt that there were endless masters to kill and heads to cut off. But now that I'm climbing higher and higher, you've taken the lead, I realize that killing here and there is no meaning. In the end, do I have to fight you to the death to live up to this life? Su Fengyan choked on a mouthful of wine and said angrily, Can't you have a conscience? White Fox's face held the wine jug to half of his face and asked with a playful smile, Are you trying to say that a woman's heart is the most vicious? Chapter 1144. It was probably Su Fengyan's first time traveling in Jianghu. The only real master he had met was right in front of him. He still had a shadow in his heart. Even though everyone in the world could fight, he still could not help but feel scared. Glancing at White Fox's chest, Su Fengyan thought to himself that with his keen eyes that had been trained by his travels, even if the woman was deliberately hiding her amorous feelings, she would not be able to escape from the scene of prosperity and peace. Would she? White Fox smiled and said, Do you want to die? Su Fengyan said calmly, I'm not scared. Even if I don't have the body of Gao Shulu and have lost most of my spirit, it won't be easy for you to kill me. White Fox raised her eyebrows and said, Oh, you're really promising. Su Fengyan suddenly leaped back 30 to 40 feet with the wine pot in his hand. Flustered and exasperated, he cursed, White Fox face. You really turned hostile just like that? White Fox squinted her eyes, full of murderous intent. Su Fengyan sighed and waved his hand at the top of the mountain. Wang Shang ran over with a blushing face. He still looked like an honest man with a sword case and a famous sword. He lowered his head and explained, "Master, I couldn't sleep so I walked here." Su Fengnian made a sound of acknowledgement. He turned his head to look at White Fox's face and asked, "Approximately when will you leave for Northern Mang?" White Fox said calmly, "At least 3 months, at most half a year." Su Fengnian smiled and said, "Then bring my second disciple, Wang Sheng." White Fox nodded and did not refuse. After getting the answer, Su Fengnian said softly, "Go to bed early after you go down the mountain." The tall, dark-skinned girl turned and left silently. White Fox looked at Su Fengnian, who returned to his seat and asked with a frown, "You're willing to leave such a good unpolished gem to me?" Su Fengnian shook his head and said, "Staying by my side won't make any progress. If one's martial arts cultivation is not tempered enough, it will be wasted. If one doesn't walk back and forth from the gates of hell a few times, no matter how talented one is, it will be useless." White Fox was still staring at Su Fengnian. Su Fengnian said awkwardly, "You can probably tell that this girl can either learn from you and become an imposing man, or she can only stay in Bailiang and not adapt to the environment there. She can only be considered a graceful woman with an orchid aura. It's fine if it's an ordinary girl, but this doesn't match Wang Sheng's temperament. Actually, among the 3 disciples, I am the most selfish towards her and have the highest hopes for her." However, she couldn't say such things out loud. Once she did, the pressure on her, who was far more meticulous than Lu Yunzhang, would be even greater. She might even collapse. When Wang Sheng followed you through northern Liang and arrived at northern Mang, he was able to borrow the vigorous wind and masculine energy unique to the frontier fortress to concentrate all of his energy in one go. This is much more direct and effective than any verbal instruction or reading through secret manuals. Su Fengnian swirled his wine glass and smiled. "Of the 3 disciples, I will take Lu Yuanlong with me, otherwise I won't be at ease. Lu Yunzhang will be thrown to the Fish Dragon Gang for a period of time and then thrown to the border. As for Wang Sheng, she will go with you." Su Fengnian turned his head to look at a place further north than Bailiang and said softly, "Beimang. I have been there and know that the sky is high and the ground is broad. Moreover, there is a person who practiced swordsmanship there." White Fox looked at the man who was less than 30 years old. He walked the Jianghu with a saber in hand. After all, it was just for revenge. What was the purpose of drinking the horse in the north? Su Fengnian patted his forehead and ran down the mountain. White Fox looked at him with disdain. What else could this guy be doing down the mountain in such a hurry? Wutangan was full of women. Su Fengnian did go to Wutangan, but he didn't have any obscene thoughts. The 2 future concubines of Mount Qingliang, Wang Chudong, who was only second to his second sister, went to give lectures at an academy in Liangzhou. Lu Chengyan was burdened by her troublesome family and had to work hard. She could only stay in Wutangan to accumulate merits for the Lu family's disciples. It was a bit like making up for her mistakes. Even Su Weisheng had mentioned that Su Fengnian must go to the courtyard to see his poor sister-in-law, who was not well received by her in-laws. Su Fengnian walked into the elegant and quiet courtyard where the lights never went out at night. He felt a little sad and thought of the exquisite maids, Green Ant, and the others. They had no choice but to live in a different Jianghu. They were not young and vigorous at all. From the beginning to the end, there were only cold schemes and betrayals. Su Fengnian didn't rush into the house. He looked around the familiar courtyard where the lights were as bright as day and the smiles of those young women lingered. He wondered if they were really happy when they played here year after year. Tonight, Lu Qingyan and a third-rank maid, Xiangu, were on duty. The 3 tables were piled up like a mountain. Xiangu grew up in Wutangan since she was young, so Su Fengnian was very familiar with her. At this moment, she was concentrating on holding a sharp stone badger pen. The pen was heavy with ink, but the ink was evenly spat out evenly. It was easy to write for a long time, and it had always been Xian Ji's favorite pen. Probably because she was hesitant about something, she didn't dare to write for a long time. The tip of the pen dipped in ink had already drawn ink stains of different shades on her face. She was completely unaware, like a cat with a dirty face. Other than Xiangu, there was another fresh face. Su Fengyan knew that she was a young girl that second sister had carefully selected. Her name was Jun Qiu, and she could be considered a newcomer in Wutangan. The secret files in her hands were somewhat cruder than the senior Xian Ji's. She was originally using her 5 fingers to hold her other wrist and gently turned it. Very quickly, she saw the figure of the king of Bailiang and jumped in shock. She was about to spring up and solemnly pay her respects. Xian Gu also came back to her senses. Su Fengyan made a gesture to them to keep quiet and quietly walked to the innermost table. He saw the young woman who was more unfamiliar than familiar leaning over the table and sleeping. Her slender shoulders and light snoring sounds indicated that she was exhausted. Su Fengyan gently moved a chair over and sat beside her. He looked at the piles of official documents that had been neatly placed after being signed and then carefully sorted out. Her arms were pressed against a document that had not yet been written. Su Fengyan lowered his head to look. It was an official document from Liuzhou. It talked about the large change of personnel that was currently being carried out in secret. Batch after batch of refugees were being moved into the prosperous Lingzhou in an orderly manner. Then, the foreign scholars who did not have a seat in the Liuzhou officialdom would be moved into Liuzhou to become officials and officials. Su Fengyan pulled back his gaze and seriously sized up this Qingzhou woman that he had always been distant from. She wore a small flowery brocade dress that was like when in Rome. It was far from the layers of soft and tender clothing of Jiangnan women. The temperature difference between day and night in Bailiang was extremely large. There was a light green overcoat that was used to keep out the cold hanging on the back of the chair. It was probably because she had slept in a hurry that she forgot to put it on. Thus, when she slept, she unconsciously hugged her arms tightly. Most likely, she did not sleep well. Su Fengyan sighed. He carefully took out the overcoat and covered her with it. Of course, Su Fengyan knew that this was the woman from the Lu family that even Lu Feiqi, who was the pillar of the country, adored and admired from the bottom of his heart. Lu Qingyan was very smart. It was because of her intelligence that she could feel that the Su family, from Su Xiao to Su Weisheng, as well as her husband, favored Wang Chudong more than her. However, such a woman who had never shown any grievances or hidden bitterness, had even pulled out a sword to kill people outside the new Lu family ancestral hall. Not only the old and young of the Lu family, but even her father would probably be dissatisfied. Although it was inevitable that a married daughter would be like spilled water, her elbows were too biased towards the Su family. She actually did not let the Lu family, her maiden family, gain any advantage. Anyone would inevitably criticize her silently. Then why did she, Lu Qingyan, marry into the Su family? The Lu family had gone through untold hardships and came to this poor place to settle down. Shouldn't they enjoy some good fortune and bask in some glory? Su Fengyan sat next to Lu Qingyan and began to personally annotate the official documents. During this time, the third-rank maid, Xian Gu, tiptoed over and whispered that Miss Lu wanted her to wake her up in half an hour. Su Fengyan waved his hand. In the dead of night, only the tip of the brush could be heard as it brushed across the Xian paper. The new maid, Jun Qiu, would occasionally pluck up her courage and turn her head to sneak a peek at the extremely wealthy young man. When the sky outside the window turned white, Su Fengyan finished annotating all the official documents and quietly walked out of Wutangan. Jun Qiu did not feel sleepy the entire night. Every time she peeked, she could not see how this elegant young vassal king could kill that martial emperor city's city lord. That was an old monster who had lived for 100 years. Xian Gu, who had not dared to make a sound, took a pile of waste paper and threw it at the ignorant maid. The latter playfully stuck out her tongue. When Lu Qingyan woke up in a daze, Su Fengyan had already left the city and rushed to the border. She only saw that the mountain of documents on the table had been emptied. ####. There are two things. First, there will be an event hosted by Baidu's official Tieba forum in the evening. It will be held from 8 to 10. Those who have time can participate. Second, I haven't asked for votes in a long time. I definitely have more than half a year. Snow will probably be finished in 3 to 4 months. I also hope to update more in these few months. Of course, the first prerequisite is that I have to update more in June. Therefore, I plan to give it a try. In June, I hope that those who have a monthly red ticket can support me. It seems that next month is the 2nd anniversary of Snow. I still haven't become a eunuch. I'm actually finishing the chapter. Snow is almost 5 million words. I don't have an update target for the entire month in June. I'll try to be a monk for a day and strike the bell for a day. As for you guys, you don't act until you see the hair. You can choose to start voting after I guarantee that I'll update at least one chapter. However, after 12 o'clock tonight on the 1st of June, I still hope to get off to a good start. In addition to the guaranteed chapter, I'll update at least 1,000 words for every 100 monthly votes. The upper limit is the guaranteed chapter. I can guarantee that I'll update at least 10,000 words. At the end of the 1st, I'll give you another update target for the 2nd of June. If I only update at least one chapter, I won't ask you for monthly votes. When the time comes, you can keep it to yourselves. You can vote when I'm sure that I'll update more. If I promise to update that day, I won't update that day or even the next day. Please kill me. June, the votes are coming. Chapter 11:45. In an elegant house in the forest, 2 old men sat opposite each other and ate crabs. The older man had snow-white hair, and a lazy white cat sat on the corner of the table beside him. The autumn wind made crabs itch, but it was still 20 years away from the best time to eat crabs. However, as the capital of Liang City, Great Peace City received countless tributes. Gluttons with backgrounds and connections naturally had their own ways. Fun Spring Lake in Yangzhou produced purple-whiskered yellow crabs. Because the Taoist ancestral court, Dragon Tiger Mountain, had many noble people, someone gave it the nickname Dragon Tiger Crab, which had been used to this day. Compared to other lake and river crabs, this kind of crab matured 20 years earlier. It was only autumn, but the female crabs were already yellow and full of meat. The snow-white old man had a kind face. There were porcelain plates on the table with 8 delicately made crabs. The old man was very particular about eating crabs. From time to time, he would pick up a piece of ginger and put it into his mouth to get rid of the crab chill. There was also a pretty maidservant carrying a plate with a bunch of chrysanthemums that were picked from somewhere to wipe his hands and get rid of the smell. This old man ate the crabs in an orderly manner. He was clearly an old glutton who knew how to eat crabs. The person opposite him was not young either. Compared to the old man who raised the precious, snowy lionette, he was still half a generation younger. When he ate the crabs, he obviously had to wolf them down. He ate sloppily and did not have the trivial crabs. He ate until his 10 fingers were golden and greasy. He did not forget to put them into his mouth and lick them off. Seeing this, the maidservant of the white-browed old man felt her scalp tingle. However, she did not dare to show any disdain. One had to know that this old man was the world-famous Tantanon, the head official of the Liang dynasty's Menxia province. If he did not change sides at the last minute, no one in the imperial court would dare to confront Grand Secretary Zhang Julu. However, the old man that she had carefully served for several years was not an ordinary person. He was the ancestor of the Yu family in Jiang Xian Yu Jiankong. Strictly speaking, even Tantanon should call him martial uncle. The maidservant felt somewhat helpless in her heart. The old ancestor had originally invited Sword Immortal Tang Shi to this banquet to put in a few good words. Unexpectedly, the Minister of War, Liu Baijia, was temporarily tied up with military affairs, and old Master Huan was unwilling to wait. The Yu clan's old ancestor also couldn't say anything. Yu Jiankong was precisely the dignified old man who was able to force Taoist Nun Huangguan to throw herself at Beiliang's heir apparent in the mountains behind Gangnam-do's Baogua Temple. It was also precisely because of him that Sword Immortal Tang Shi, a junior, was able to enter the capital and become an official, allowing Linlong's Liu clan to have its current flourishing atmosphere. After the old man finishes eating the crab, he rinses his mouth and wipes his hands. He exhales softly, and the servant girl who has taught him cleverly leaves. Yu Jiankong reached out to pet the white cat's head. He looked at Tantanon, who was casually wiping the grease on his clothes. He laughed softly and said, "Sir Poosh, when do you have time to go to Jiang'an? Let this old man do his duty as a host." Tantanon smiled and said, "Elder Yu, our relationship hasn't reached that point yet, so let's not blindly exchange pleasantries. To tell the truth, There are still a few old debts that haven't been settled yet. However, no matter how I calculate them, they're all muddled up. I, Huanwen, have been able to deceive myself these past few years, but elder, you shouldn't continue to deceive others. Yu Jiankong deeply looked at Tantanon, whom he hadn't seen for over 20 years. He suppressed the gloomy feeling in his heart, like a small lotus that had just revealed its tip, and said self-mockingly, "Back then, this old man truly underestimated you and broke up a pair of mandarin ducks. This is also one of this old man's greatest regrets." Huanwen shook his arm and got straight to the point. "Don't worry. Elder Yu is Elder Yu, Yu Lian is Yu Lian, and Lu Baijie is even more so Lu Baijie. I, Huanwen, am not so petty as to take my anger out on others. It's just that Huanwen can't become the Minister of Personnel who has entered the palace 3 times. He can't compete with Zhang Lu's disciple Zhao Yuling. I, Huanwen, am indeed one of the obstacles, but it's not because of personal grudges. It's just that Yu Lian, this wooden pillar, can't support the Ministry of Personnel. If it were a yamen like the Ministry of Revenue or the Ministry of Works, Huanwen could still turn a blind eye to it. However, if he wants to take control of the Ministry of Personnel, which is about to be raised in rank, then he, Yu Lian, will have to pray that thick smoke will rise from his ancestors' graves." The elderly head of the Yu family, who had been indirectly scolded, smiled. He didn't get angry, and it wasn't that he was deliberately concealing his anger. It was just that the old man with snow-white eyebrows really wasn't angry. Huanwen continued bluntly, "The Ministry of War was incompetent and made the Guangling Road a mess, giving Chao Chongqing an opportunity to easily wipe them out. I, Huanwen, have a bit of resentment in my heart. If I don't scold the Minister of War, Lu Baijie, who else can I scold? If you want to blame someone, blame him for sitting in that position. If it were Gu Jiantang or Qin Jibao, I'd scold them all the same. Of course, Lu Baijie hasn't been an assistant minister for long, and he hasn't even warmed up from the position of minister yet. He's been scolded quite wrongly this time. Even Yu Jiankong didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He said helplessly, "You don't just scold people with your mouth. You also hit people. Right now, the entire world knows that sword immortal Tongshi was almost kicked in the chest by you, Lord Push." Huanwen slapped the table and said angrily, "I'm just a bag of old bones, and I almost sprained my ankle. Who am I supposed to judge?" Yu Jiankong sighed. He didn't plan on tangling with this scoundrel over this matter. Everyone in the court knew that it wasn't important whether or not Tantanon kicked Minister Lu. What was important was that the left push of the provincial governor was furious at the newly appointed Ministry of War. This would affect the entire situation. Even if Lu Baijie was highly regarded by the emperor, if he gave off a terrible impression of being hated by Tantanon, then Lu Baijie's ambitions would be hindered in many ways. Even if he could succeed, it would be greatly reduced. The hearts of the people in the Ministry of War were already wavering, and the Ministry of Appointments, which had been suppressed for a long time, showed signs of rising again. As the new leader of the Jiangnan scholar group, Lu Baijie, who had a clear reputation, originally even had hopes of reaching greater heights and not being constrained by the Ministry of War. In the end, he was kicked by Huanwen, and everything changed. Among the Jiangnan scholars, there was Yu Jiankong, who had once been evaluated, but weren't there just a few old fellows hiding behind the scenes in Jiangnan? Yu Jiankong could pick up and let go. He asked, "Then what about Su Gong?" Huanwen glanced at Yu Jiankong and said unhappily, "I'm not a green-eyed child. It's not difficult for me to hinder someone's future, but I can't and don't want to do the work of promoting someone else. Elder Yu has picked up the wrong pig head and entered the wrong temple. Besides, with Elder Yu's decades of friendship, it doesn't seem like he needs to burn incense to anyone. In the past, the Gumusu family was propped up by 2 pillars. The outstanding dragon general Su Gong was outside, and Su Shufei was inside. Unfortunately, because the latter was Su Zhao's eldest daughter, she was caught by the empress and thrown into the cold palace. She probably wouldn't be able to see the light of day for the rest of her life. When she went to Changchun Palace, not only did the Gumusu family suffer a great blow, the entire Jiangnan scholar group was seriously affected. Aristocratic families were bound together for good or ill. This had been the case since ancient times. At the time, Su Shufei had just fallen out of favor. Very quickly, a few famous Jiangnan officials with bright futures were forced back to their original positions by Zhao Yuling's Ministry of Appointments. In officialdom, laughing at others and being laughed at often happened in a single night. There was no such thing as 30 years in the East and 30 years in the West. If it wasn't for Liu Baijia's meteoric rise in Great Peace City, the scholars in Jiangnan would have had an even harder time. Disregarding everything else, the day Liu Baijia was promoted to Minister of War, the number of people in the guild halls in the various provinces of Jiangnan doubled. Later, after Tantanan scolded the Ministry of War, another 30% of them silently left. Yu Jiankong gently stroked the white cat's back. He shook his head and sighed. The difference between being in the palace and not being in it is like the difference between heaven and earth. Inside, if you ask someone to do something, they should be deeply grateful. Outside, asking someone to do something isn't very effective. Yu Jiankong used the pretense of interceding for Liu Baijia, but in reality, he was plotting for Su Gong's future. Because the two old men were very clear about the situation, Liu Baijia's temporary rise and fall on the stage couldn't stop the trend of this favored person. However, Dragon General Su Gong was different. The court already had an undercurrent that suppressed generals. The Ministry of Appointments promoted him higher than the Ministry of War. Gu Jiantang was confined to the northern border by a gaudy title of Pillar of the Country. Why were Yang Xinxing, Yan Jinchuan, and the other military veterans in such a hurry to go down south? Wasn't it because they could see that there wouldn't be such a shop after this village? They were all trying to accumulate as much merit as possible for their descendants. If Su Gong missed this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, it would be even harder for him to stand out in the future. In the entire spring and autumn period, there was only Su Xiao the butcher who could create his own momentum. Gu Jiantang could only be considered half a person. As for the others, even someone as ambitious and ruthless as Liu Shengxiang, no matter how talented they were, was just borrowing power. Chapter 1146. Huan Wen hesitated and didn't say anything. Yu Jiankong was stunned. This fellow had never been one to drag his feet, yet he was actually hesitating about something. The old ancestor's expression immediately turned serious. Huan Wen suddenly asked an inexplicable and unrelated question. Elder Yu, how many years do you have left to live? How about 15 years? Yu Jiankong couldn't grasp the mystery and could only tell the truth. He smiled and said, I don't dare to think too much about 15 years. But I definitely won't be able to lie down in a coffin within 10 years. Huan Wen nodded and said in a deep voice, All right, then I, Huan Wen, will make an exception and help Su Gong say a few words. Within 3 years, I will definitely make him a general with real power. To be honest, if we follow the way you Jiangnan scholars operate, Su Gong won't be able to get promoted. Only death awaits him. As repayment, Yu Jiankong will have to write 2 words for someone before you die. Yu Jiankong frowned and was somewhat puzzled. Huan Wen used his finger to write 2 words on the table, then stood up and left. Yu Jiankong looked at the empty table without any words and didn't send Tantanan off. After a long silence, he sighed and said, Bai Yan with such a good friend, what is there to be afraid of in death? The Beimang Empress was far more open-minded than any man in the world. She allowed the Southern Dynasty to form its own imperial court. The Southern Dynasty had 6 ministries but didn't have the 2 provinces of the Hall of Secretaries. However, there was an additional king of the Southern Courtyard. However, the minister of the 6 ministries was still 1 rank lower than the North Court. The king of the Southern Courtyard, Huang Songpu, had a declining status in Beimang, especially after his trusted aide, Hong Guang, was buried at the Gentleman's Pavilion on the border. This dealt a heavy blow to Huang Songpu, who was born from a small noble family in Beiqian. The general Lu Gue, who was born as a commoner, and Yang Yuanzhan, who had joined the army, didn't take advantage of this situation to wantonly encroach on Huang Songpu's power and territory. Ever since the Longxiang army crushed the front line of the Tile Gentleman's Pavilion to pieces, many of the first-class noble families had become much more restrained. The old people who had dared to criticize the 3 generals felt the oppressive atmosphere before a storm. They no longer spoke carelessly about how they didn't even need 100,000 soldiers to overturn Beiliang. The Southern dynasty had profited from the disaster. A rare, harmonious atmosphere had appeared in the Southern dynasty. Dong's increasing power and almost irresistible external forces had risen. Hong Jingyan had obtained all of the Ruran cavalry. The confrontation between the two in the Southern dynasty's imperial court had, to a large extent, diverted some of the old contradictions from before. The king of the southern courtyard, Huang Songpu, was increasingly unable to command the 400,000-strong army of the Southern dynasty. Both inside and outside the imperial court were well aware of this. However, a starving camel was still bigger than a horse. As long as the two generals, Lu Gui and Yang Yuanzhan, didn't fall out with Huang Songpu, no one dared to challenge him face to face. Except for that damned fatty. At this very moment, Dong, who had even more military power, had nearly 100,000 men and horses under his command, and all of them were elite soldiers. This Dong, who had an extremely bad relationship with people in the imperial court, was cursing loudly. He was practically pointing at Huang Songpu's nose and spitting saliva. "Old man Huang, have you been blinded by lard? Are you thinking of fighting Bailiang to decide the outcome of the battle? Let me ask you, how did that Hong Guan, who should have been dragged out and whipped, die? He had the advantage in numbers and geography, but didn't he still lose to the Longxiang army, which had temporarily switched from heavy cavalry to light cavalry? Let me make a bet with you. If you do this, let alone flatten Bailiang, His Imperial Majesty's tent might even be raided by the Su family's cavalry. You damned old man, are you blind? After great ancestor Gu passed away, the great defensive line in Bailiang, which used 14 passes as key nodes, became a quagmire. They were determined to stay at the second line of defense with you, slowly flirting with us. If the 400,000-strong army pounces on us, Bailiang can afford it, but can we? Do you really think that the Su family's cavalry on the other side won't intercept us and allow us to freely transport the provisions? The more Fatty Dong spoke, the more unscrupulous he became. The white-haired Huang Songpu remained expressionless, too lazy to wipe off the fatty's saliva. For the first time, Yang Yuanzhan and Lu Gui didn't stop Dong's unruly behavior. While Dongzhu took a break to catch his breath, Huang Songpu calmly asked, "Are you done scolding?" Dongzhu bent over and hurriedly raised his arm. "Wait a little longer." Many of the old officials in the imperial court, who were used to seeing strange things, rolled their eyes. Some of the young nobles were more or less shocked. Huang Songpu really didn't say anything. Dongzhu moved his mouth, as if he was trying to produce some saliva so that he could scold more efficiently. Dongzhu straightened his back and was about to scold Huang Songpu to wake up this muddle-headed old man. At the entrance of the main hall, several tall men with profound authority walked in. They weren't too old, but their official titles couldn't be any bigger. Most of them were important officials of Beimang who lived in the Southern Dynasty but could completely ignore this imperial court. The abbot. As for the others, they were as rare as phoenix feathers and qilin horns in northern Mang, but their statuses were even more transcendent. Dongzhu felt the strange atmosphere around him. He turned his head and opened his mouth wide. "Oh my, is this still the imperial court of the Southern Dynasty? Isn't this the most solemn meeting in the king's tent?" These uninvited guests included the two abbot of Gusai State and Dragon Waste State, the abbot of Orange State, Murong Baoding, and the great General Zhong Shentong. Huang Songpu slowly opened his mouth and said, "I've already sent a memorial to His Majesty. If it's approved, the army going south to Bailiang won't be just the 400,000 soldiers of the Southern Dynasty. Now it seems that it's most likely approved." Hong Jingyan glanced at Dongzhu and smiled coldly. Dongzhu tactfully shut his mouth. He shook his head and looked left and right, pretending that nothing had happened. Huang Songpu nodded lightly at the abbot and the great general. Then he said calmly to Dongzhu, "In the memorial, I've also resigned as the king of the northern court. I've recommended you to His Majesty, Dongzhu." Dongzhu was dumbstruck. The fat man suddenly came to his senses. His eyes were wet as he tightly grasped Huang Songpu's hand. "Old general, you're so worried about the country and the people. It's so touching. Do you have any granddaughters you're worried about? For example, that unmarried Huang Anghuang?" "I, Dongzhu, am willing to help take care of her. Huang Songpu said coldly, if you dare to take one step into the Huang mansion, I'll break your 3 dog legs. Dong Zhuo retracted his hand and chuckled. I haven't become the king of the southern courtyard yet, have I? All the good things in the world are safe in my bag. Otherwise, everything will be empty. Hong Jingyan narrowed his eyes and looked on coldly. Huang Songpu ignored the snobbish fat man. He walked to the center of the hall and looked around. The white-haired old man who had been on the battlefield for half his life was probably no longer the king of the southern court. He didn't say anything and just clasped his hands. Not only the generals who had made great contributions on the battlefield, but even the civil officials also clasped their hands subconsciously to return the greeting. On the border of Beiliang, a cavalry troop slowly moved forward. There were more than 50 riders. No one was anyone's retinue. Everyone had an official position. Among them was the Beiliang governor Chu Lushan, Beiliang's cavalry commander Yuan Zuozong, infantry commander Yen Wenluan, as well as the infantry and cavalry deputy commanders Ancestor Gu, Zhou Kong, He Zhonghu, and Chen Yunshui, Su Zhao's second son Su Longxiang, Liangzhou General Shi Fu, Lingzhou General Han Laozhan, Yuzhou General Huang Fucheng, as well as Wang Ji and Zhao Wui and a few new deputy generals. Next were the commanders of the various brigades, as well as more than a dozen captains who guarded the important passes in Beiliang. Tongguan Captain Wei Zhuqing, Xian In Horse, Weak String Captain Li Maozhen, Fengqiu Captain Zhu Boyu, North Country Captain Ren Chunyun. There was also a large group of newly promoted border captains. Without exception, they were all strong men around 30 years old. They all had military achievements and their eyes were resolute. Leading them was the king of Beiliang, Su Fengnian. How did the northern Liang, which many people mistakenly thought was lacking in manpower, produce so many young and strong generals after careful investigation? Such a lineup was enough to make enemies of any status feel their hair stand on end. The 50 cavalrymen tacitly lined up at the top of a high slope. They quietly looked down at Beimang. Yen Wenluan suddenly laughed loudly and said, "Old guys over 40 years old. Take a step back and let the young people take the lead. How about it?" Ancestor Gu, Chen Yunshui, and the other old guys looked at each other and smiled, silently retreating. This cavalry troop was slightly uneven. However, their majestic aura did not decrease at all. Because on the front line, there were more than 30 people. Whether it was Liang or Beimang, it seemed that it was impossible to bring out so many young and strong generals who could fight on the same front at the same time. It was even more impossible to make Yen Wenluan and the other famous generals of the spring and autumn period willingly cover the rear. The young king holding an iron spear used the tip of the spear to draw a horizontal line on the ground at the same level as the front horse's hooves. Chapter 1147. In the desert, 500 cavalry against 500 cavalry. The two sides were all lightly armored elite cavalry. They did not have bows or crossbows, and the only weapon in their hands was a wooden pole. One side was the elite cavalry from Yuan Zuozong's Jibei camp, and the other side was He Zhonghu's Iron Monument camp. The reason why the two sides were practicing martial arts here was not because the group of Northern Liang elders in the distance wanted to see the battle prowess of Northern Liang with their own eyes. Instead, it was for a reason that even those outside the Northern Liang path would find inconceivable. Horse competition. Beiliang placed the most importance on horse management, and there were pastures all over the place. Among them, Yanji pastures sent out the most horses, producing 1,600 horses a year, of which around 300 could be used for cavalry. This was a shocking number in the Liang imperial court. One must know that even though Nanjing had 7 pastoral supervisors in 3 prefectures, it was barely the same number. Of course, the pastures in the south of the capital were inferior and the horse management was poor. Beiliang's Xianli pastures were the best. Over the years, the number of horses allocated to the elite cavalry units of Northern Liang had never changed. However, the quality of the war horses sent from the various pastures was very particular. Even when Huaihua's great general Zhong Hangu held the power of the cavalry, he could not control the allocation of good horses. He had to follow a rule, and that was that every cavalry in Beiliang had to fight in pairs. If they won, they would take the good horses. If they lost, they could only eat the leftovers of others. A few cavalry troops with over 10,000 people would choose 800 cavalry each time. Another cavalry troop with similar combat strength would choose elite soldiers and fight each other. The flag-holding camp would send out 500 people, and the small camp would send out 200 to 300 people. Beiliang claimed to have 300,000 cavalry, but it was referring to the total strength. Naturally, it could not be all cavalry. In fact, the total number of Beiliang cavalry had always been between 100 and 150,000. Otherwise, unless Liang sent all the horses in the world to Beiliang, it could not support the Su family cavalry. Based on historical records, the Great Feng dynasty, which had always been crowned as the most prosperous after the Great Qin dynasty, only had 800,000 horses in the 30 years from Jinyuan to Linda. Furthermore, Beiliang's most elite cavalry always had 2 or even 3 horses per person. This was an extremely exaggerated matter in the 2 Liao provinces where the horse source was relatively abundant. Horses were the foundation of armors and weapons, the most important weapon of the country. The current commanders of Beiliang's cavalry were Yuan Zuozong, the veteran deputy commander He Zhonghu, and the Zhou partridge Zhou Kong, who was promoted last year. Out of the Su family's 140,000 cavalry, Yuan Zuozong did not lead any personal troops other than the 3 old battalions that existed before Su Shao became the king of Beiliang. Excluding the Great Snow Dragon Cavalry and the Longxiang Army, He Zhonghu led the left cavalry of 40,000, and Zhou Kong led the right cavalry of 30,000. The Jibei Battalion was one of the old battalions of Beiliang and was directly under the command of the great commander Yuan Zuozong. The Jibei Battalion's name had a deep history. After Su Shao became the vassal of Beiliang, Jizhou, where the Han family ruled, was the largest source of horses outside Beiliang. During the Spring and Autumn War, Su Shao formed many good relationships with the Han family. Later on, the entire Han family was executed, not only because they had offended the old Grand Secretary of the previous dynasty, but also because the Liang imperial court had long coveted the vast pastures of Jizhou. Thus, they could legitimately send good war horses to the northern defense line. However, the Han family's words carried enormous weight in Jizhou, and they never tampered with the numbers. However, they intentionally or unintentionally lost good horses to Beiliang. Although the Han family and the Su family became enemies later on, they were already a thorn in the side of the Zhao family. At that time, for Zhang Julu to be able to sit on the Grand Secretary's seat, the Han family played an important role. The 2 armies charged forward, and dust filled the air. A rider of the Jibei Battalion tilted his head and dodged a wooden pole that looked like an edgeless spear. He then used the pole in his hand to point at the heart of the rider opposite him, knocking him off his horse. The light rider of the Iron Tablet Battalion was only hit by the pole, but before his body landed on the ground, he was grabbed by the shoulder by his comrade and thrown back onto the horse. Then he continued to charge forward, tearing apart the enemy line. On the other hand, the riders of the Jibei Battalion and the Iron Tablet Battalion pierced each other's chests with their wooden poles at almost the same time. With the momentum of the war horse's charge, the sturdy poles bent at an astonishing angle, knocking the weaker riders off their horses on the spot. No matter how skilled the cavalry was in spear techniques, they would never use the fancy technique of killing the enemy with a single point of the pole. They would always rely on the momentum of the cavalry's charge, and the cavalry would always be so clean and neat. After each side penetrated the enemy's formation, both sides had changed positions. However, the Jibei Battalion and the Iron Tablet Battalion did not slow down their horses, nor did they stop their horses to turn around and charge again. Instead, after the cavalry successfully pierced through the enemy's formation, both sides took a large and precise arc at almost the same time, striving to gain more momentum from the collision as quickly as possible. During this period of time, the riders who fell off their horses had to immediately lead their horses away from the battlefield. After all, this was not a real battle, and falling off a horse meant death. Chun Yunchue was the deputy commander of Beiliang's infantry. He narrowed his eyes and watched the situation on the battlefield. He smiled and said, "Old He, The 120 A-class war horses from the Shenli Ranch and the 400 B-class war horses from the Koa Ranch should have nothing to do with the Iron Tablet Battalion. Hezhong was calm and said calmly, "This is just a charge. If we were at a disadvantage in the early stages, we would have lost. You, Chun Yunshui, would have died 7 or 8 times in the Battle of the Western Wall." Chun Yunshui laughed and said, "How can it be the same? The Iron Tablet Battalion is fighting against the Jibei Battalion, one of the best elite troops in Beiliang. They are not the hotheads from West Chu." Hezhong suddenly sneered and said, "Old man, why don't we make a bet? If I win, you will give me that yellow parasite scout. How about it?" Chun Yunshui laughed and scolded, "I only have 4 yellow parasite scouts in total, and they are all my treasures. I won't make this bet. I definitely won't. Also, why don't you say what you will do if you lose?" Hezhong said calmly, "The soldiers I have trained will never lose." Chun Yunshui turned his head to look at the young king of Beiliang, who was sitting high on his horse and carefully watching the battle. He smiled and said, "Your Highness, look, isn't Commander He's face as thick as the city wall?" Su Fengyan smiled and did not say anything. Chapter 1148. Hezhonghu led the troops and governed the troops. His style was ancient. He had to personally attend to everything, just like an auntie taking care of her own children. Even though he was the deputy commander of the cavalry, his eating and sleeping were no different from ordinary soldiers. Moreover, Hezhonghu did not have a wife or children. He only raised several lame old horses. This veteran general, who had meritorious service throughout his life, had made up his mind to live and die at the border. If it was based on military merit and seniority, Zhong Hangu simply wouldn't be able to sit on the cavalry commander's position. It was just that Hezhonghu had never formed a faction, and always maintained a gentleman's friendship with Wei Taizhan and those old generals who had already withdrawn from the border. He also didn't like to rope in large numbers of young and strong generals to be his students and direct subordinates. He was the one who had been the deputy commander for the longest time in the Beiliang army. Hezhonghu did not have a distinctive style in leading the army. He rarely seized a big victory. However, in the 30 years of military service, Hezhonghu had almost never suffered a crushing defeat. Li Maozhen, who was known for his experience and wisdom, used to be a subordinate of Hezhonghu. However, Li Maozhen was famous for his addiction to being an officer. He had followed Hezhonghu for many years and was often manipulated by Zhong Hongwu's henchmen. Li Maozhen left the border army and returned to Beiliang. He asked Su Shao for the position of guerrilla general. Chun Yunshui continued to fan the flames. He joked with Yuan Zuozong, "Commander Yuan, how can you bear this?" Yuan Zuozong smiled. "It's hard to say who will win. It's not good for me to clamor for a one-on-one horse battle with old General He. After all, you are old and weak." Hezhonghu suddenly glared at him. "Yuan Zuozong, if you were 20 years younger, believe it or not, I could beat you down with one hand." Yan Wenluan, who looked thin and small, laughed. "Bullsh *t. Whether it's a horse battle or a foot battle, Hezhonghu can't beat Commander Yuan even if he has 3 heads and 6 arms." Hezhonghu was the most respected person in the Beiliang army. Yan Wenluan, who had joined the army at the same time as Hezhonghu, did not refute after his identity was exposed. Chu Lushan, who was about 400 pounds of fat, did not ride a horse. He stood beside Su Fengyan's warhorse and said calmly, "Just now, we received a spy report that great General Zhong Shentong and Gu Sarangio prefectures appeared in the imperial court of the Southern Dynasty. It can be considered as a farewell for Huang Songpu, who resigned as the king of the Southern Courtyard. Moreover, the one who replaced the position was not Tuoba Bodhisattva or Murong Baoding as originally expected. It was also not great General Lu Gui, who was regarded as half a foster father by the Empress of Beimang. It was Dong Zhuo who liked to raise crows. Huang Songpu even announced publicly that Beimang was going to use all of its resources and send 1 million soldiers to Beiliang. Beimang did not deliberately hide this news. I'm sure that Emperor Zhao and Gu Jiantang will be overjoyed when they hear this. The deputy commander of the cavalry, Zhou Kong, laughed. "Dong Zhuo? Wasn't he defeated by you, Lord Protector General?" Zhou Kong, who was the only one standing, rubbed his hands and laughed. Back then, there was still a bit of luck involved. Yan Wenluan thought for a while and laughed coldly. The king of Beliang's actions are not only because they value him, but also because they are wary of him. Chu Lushan nodded and said slowly, Little Fatty Dong has always been treated as half a son by that old woman. It would be more reassuring to hand over the military power of the Southern dynasty to a young man like him who doesn't have a deep foundation. However, this fellow had an entire 100,000 elite personal guards who only knew the word Dong, but not Northern Mang. Even an old woman would have to think twice before doing so. Dong Zhuo is a slippery person. If he doesn't take the lead as the king of the Southern courtyard, once the war starts, with his temperament of not acting until he sees a rabbit, even if he is forced to take the field, he will definitely not put in any effort. When the time comes, both Liang Mang and Bei Mang will suffer heavy losses. In the end, the Dong family will have the most soldiers. In this way, even if Dong Zhuo doesn't have any ambition, he will still have to be ambitious. Su Fengyan said, I heard that Dong Zhuo has always regarded you as an irreconcilable enemy. Dong Zhuo said cheerfully, That little fatty thinks so, but Lu Qiu'er doesn't think so of him. Great ancestor Gu, who was once the mainstay of the Southern Tang Empire, smiled knowingly. If Dong Zhuo didn't become the king of the Southern courtyard, I would have almost forgotten the amazing achievements of our protector general. Chu Lushan raised his fat arm and waved it gently. He pretended to be shy and said, A real man doesn't talk about his past achievements. Su Fengyan, who couldn't stand it anymore, raised his foot and gently kicked Chu Lushan's shoulder. He said, The Iron Tablet Camp won, but there are only 21 cavalrymen left on horseback. Everyone looked over. It was indeed so. The 21 cavalrymen of the Iron Tablet Camp raised one arm at the same time and calmly accepted the thunderous cheers. He Zhong suddenly laughed heartily. He looked at Yuan Zuozong, who was not far away. The latter's eyes were clear and he nodded to the old man. Then He Zhong suddenly rode forward and shouted to those men, Come! The old rules, take your wives. The excellent war horses of the Shenli Ranch and the Koa Ranch, under the leadership of the shepherds, slowly galloped out from the side of the battlefield where the dust had settled. The 500 cavalrymen cheered and yelled. They dismounted and welcomed the new wives. Some of the cavalrymen of the Iron Tablet Camp made a series of dizzying somersaults while galloping forward. Some of them were kicked on the buttocks by their comrades behind them and fell flat on their faces. The 500 cavalrymen were so happy and noisy. Beliang's horses had always been the wives of Beliang's valiant soldiers. Who would complain about having too many war horses that were rarer than beautiful women? Su Fengyan looked at the 500 cavalrymen of the Jibei camp. Everyone was holding their horses and standing in silence. Su Fengyan squeezed the horse's belly and went out alone. He first went to the Iron Tablet camp, who were busy selecting war horses. He signaled them to not salute and let them continue to pick their wives. He quietly waited for them to finish selecting. When everyone got on their horses, he looked at one of the cavalrymen who had killed the enemy the most. Su Fengyan took the new cold saber from his waist and threw it up high. The young and burly cavalryman caught the cold saber. He was stunned at first. Then his face turned red and tears filled his eyes. He shouted and raised the saber up high. Su Fengyan still rode forward. He came to the front of the Jibei camp and dismounted. He led the horse forward and handed the reins to the leading cavalryman. Chapter 1149. In autumn, Su Fengyan's trip to the north took about 20 days. Most of the time, he strolled leisurely around Jinyuan, Qinghe, Zhongzhong, and Huaiyang. During this period, Yan Wenluan, Chen Yunshui, and a few other veteran generals with heavy military duties gradually left. Then Han Laozhan, Huang Fuqian, and the other provincial generals and deputy generals left for the south. Then Wei Shaking, Xianma, and the other captains who had real power in the territory left. Finally, it was the turn of the second-line border army generals and captains who were not stationed here. Huang Laifu, the lieutenant of Huaiyang, wanted to give up his official residence, but the governor-general, who was always fond of extravagance, did not agree. Instead, he casually bought a residence from a big family in the pass. It was said that after receiving the 3,000 taels of silver, the head of the family could not sleep well for several days and repeatedly wanted to return the money to the governor-general where Lu Qiu'er was in charge. Unfortunately, the governor-general ignored him. Later, the head of the family was so restless that he could not eat or sleep well. He had to ask an expert for advice and added another 2,000 taels of silver, which he donated to the Huaiyang Pass as the army's salary. This family, who had been rich from the border trade in the early years, finally felt a little relieved. However, they still secretly moved to a Wubao residence dozens of miles south of the Huaiyang Pass. Chu Lushan's fierce reputation was evident. In addition to Chu Lushan and Huang Laifu, the two landlords of Huaiyang Pass, there were also a group of young captains from the border and the territory. Wang Chou, the speaker of Anliang Army Town, Chao Xiaojiao, the Honglu general, who was famous for being a troublemaker in the northern defense line of Yuzhou province, Hong Xinjia, the real person in charge of many Wu forts in Yuzhou province, Zhu Boyu, the Fengqiu commandant of Lingzhou province, and Ren Chunyun, the North Country captain, who came from a poor family. Both of them performed outstandingly in the Battle of Fuding in Lingzhou province. Huang Xiaokuai, the Pearl commandant of the vanguard, was promoted to the deputy general of Lingzhou province and assisted Han Laozhan together with Wang Zhi. However, Huang Xiaokuai did not follow the order to go to the north this time. Instead, he was replaced by Zhao Wui. Compared to these three people, Ma Jinchai, the frozen field commandant of Zhigui Prefecture, was really unlucky. She could not even keep her official title, let alone being promoted. After arriving at the northern defense line, Su Fengnian rarely spoke, except for listening to the military intelligence and customs affairs from the generals and generals. He didn't even ask many questions. Occasionally, he asked some trivial questions about the border defense. He didn't say anything heroic, nor did he deliberately show off his knowledge of the art of war in front of the legendary warriors and young warriors. In fact, many people sincerely wanted to hear about the feats of the king of Beiliang in Jianghu. After all, he was the new champion of Jianghu who could even defeat Wang Xianji. No matter how arrogant Su Fengnian was, even the elders like Yan Wenluan and Gu Dezhu were willing to listen to him. However, the young king disappointed everyone. He didn't mention a single word about his travels in Jianghu and the battles of life and death. After Su Fengnian ascended to the top of Jianghu, in addition to the hidden ambush at Iron Gate Pass, the deeds of killing Diwu Raccoon, the master of Mount Tibing, and Han Diaoxi, the killer cat, also began to quietly spread in the imperial court of Liang. A group of people walked to the top of the city wall. Among them, Chao Xiaojiao, who was newly conferred the title of Honglu General, was a short and vigorous middle-aged man. He had a good reputation in the eastern defense line of Beiliang in the north of Yuzhou and had accumulated enough military merits. However, because he repeatedly offended Zhong Hangu, the great general of Beiliang, he didn't even get the title of a general. After Zhong Hangu fell, Su Fengnian specially asked Beiliang to keep an eye on him for about half a year before he decided to promote him. Of course, Chao Xiaojiao was not a perfect person. He had a strong desire to kill and was ruthless in his management of the army. Many of his subordinates violated the rules and even embezzled the salary of the border guards. Zhong Hangu used these reasons to keep Chao Xiaojiao in the position of a small lieutenant. Chao Xiaojiao was like a sharp blade that could hurt others, but he could also hurt himself. Su Fengnian's use of this person was not without criticism in the Beiliang army. Even the old General Chun Yunshui had some objections. As for Hong Xinjia, who was a full head taller than Chao Xiaojiao, his reputation was much better. Beiliang had a lot of hereditary military records in the Wu Castle. The gourd mouth area was especially prominent. The king of the southern courtyard once said that even if Beimang threw in 160,000 soldiers, they might not be able to fill it up. More than half of this could be attributed to Hong Xinjia's achievements. He was only mediocre when it came to leading troops in war, but whether it was managing the military affairs or building the Wu Castle system, he was one of the few geniuses in the Liang dynasty. He was also a master of investigation and knowledge. Gu Jiantang valued this person a lot. When he was in charge of military affairs in the northern region as the Minister of War, it was said that the general had secretly asked Zhang Lu to bring Hong Xinjia to the Liao and improve the defense line. After the request was rejected, There was even a ridiculous attempt to mobilize Zhaogo to kidnap Hong Xinjia. Walking to the top of the city wall, Su Fengnian looked to the east with his hands folded in his sleeves. He suddenly turned his head to look at Hong Xinjia, who was a block away from him. He called out Hong Xinjia's nickname, Lord of the Earth, and said with a smile, General Gu Jiantang, who is stationed in the Liao, recently offered this king a sky-high price. He promised that as long as he handed over the title of Lord of the Earth, he would help Beiliang get 30% more grain and 300,000 taels of silver from the imperial court. He also promised that you would be promoted by 3 ranks. You are only 1 step away from becoming a duke. Hong Xinjia grinned. First of all, it doesn't matter if I want to go or not. Second of all, I really don't care about the title of Lord of the Earth, as long as I can get things done. I've managed the gourd mouth area for more than 10 years, and I can't bear to leave. Su Fengnian shook his head. Tell me the truth. Chapter 1150. Hong Xinjia's face, which was as dark as charcoal due to years of exposure to the sun and wind, could actually be seen blushing. Chao Xiaojiao immediately mocked. Old Hong fears nothing but his wife. His wife is an auntie from Yanji County. She's such a beautiful flower and she's stuck on top of Hong Xinjia, this black cow dung. Last year, she even gave birth to a big fat son for him. How could that woman be at ease with her man going to Liang to be a high-ranking official? We used to say that the woman's words were more effective than a general's. As for the imperial edict from the imperial court, even if it really reached the Hong residence, wouldn't that woman directly throw it into the latrine? Isn't that right, old Hong? Hong Xinjia elbowed Chao Xiaojiao's ribs. The latter didn't block it and rubbed it with a mischievous smile. You hit me, right? The prince also saw it with his own eyes. I won't pay back the 28,000 taels of silver I owe you. Hong Xinjia, who was close to Chao Xiaojiao, widened his eyes. Just as he was about to speak, he suddenly realized that the king of Beiliang was beside him. He forced himself to swallow back the family scandal that he almost blurted out. Su Fengnian dismissed it with a smile. He didn't follow the vine to get to the melon and get to the bottom of it. Chu Lushan frowned imperceptibly. Su Fengnian looked at the sky and said jokingly to the group of generals and lieutenants around him, You guys, go back to your homes and find your mothers. When they walked down the city wall, Chu Lushan approached Su Fengnian and asked in a low voice, Deploy 500 elite cavalry to protect the prince? Su Fengnian, who was followed by his eldest disciple who was a burden, shook his head. Chu Lushan didn't dare to make a decision on his own. At most, he could only secretly add more people. He quickly calculated in his mind. There were still a few old but strong falcons in the upper room of the Fushui Society. In the end, Su Fengnian and Yu Dilong left Huayang Pass on their horses. Yu Dilong barely learned horsemanship. Although the ride was bumpy, at least he didn't fall off the horse. Among the 3 disciples, Yu Dilong was the least close to his master, Su Fengnian. Although Lu Yunzhang was noisy, he ultimately spoke more to his immortal master. Although Wang Shang was reticent, he was undoubtedly the one who respected Su Fengnian the most. Only Yu Dilong didn't know how to deal with his master, nor did he take the initiative to get close to him. The only emotion he revealed was a natural fear that came from the bottom of his heart. Su Fengnian had already taught Wang Shang swordsmanship and Lu Yunzhang fist techniques, but for some reason, he didn't carve Yu Dilong, who was better than his junior sister and junior brother in terms of luck and bone. He didn't even let Yu Dilong memorize a set of basic internal energy mantras. Chao Xiaojiao and Hong Xinjia came together and returned together. Because of Hong Xinjia, who was coveted by the Liang Imperial Court, Protector General Chu sent half a battalion of cavalry to escort him. Chao Xiaojiao and Hong Xinjia sat across from each other in a carriage. Chao Xiaojiao kept pouring wine. Hong Xinjia hesitated for a moment and finally said, How can you speak without thinking? Do you really think you don't know that the prince and the protector general don't know that you're covered in shit? Why did you take off your pants on the city wall? Who are you trying to show to? Chao Xiaojiao cast a sidelong glance at Hong Xinjia, who had spent half his life dealing with dirt and rocks. He smiled and asked, Do you still remember what you were worried about on the way here? Hong Xinjia nodded. Naturally, with your stinky reputation, who would cover you up? Even a handful of yellow mud would be like shit. Since the prince made an exception to promote you, he would normally use both grace and authority. Although I don't have the ability to comprehend things as an official, I still understand this principle. Normally, when the prince meets you, he would give you a few words of warning. Chao Xiaojiao laughed. That's right, that's common sense. So if the prince were to give me a sincere and earnest lecture, or even give me a torrent of abuse, I would feel at ease. But have you realized that this prince of ours is very strange? From start to finish, he hasn't given me, Chao Xiaojiao, a corrupt and ruthless official, a few words. Hong Xinjia froze and said in surprise, "That's true." Chao Xiaojiao raised his sleeve to wipe his mouth. "That's why I'm afraid. Otherwise, I wouldn't have dared to provoke the prince in front of Demon Chu on the city walls. If that wasn't a slap to Chu Lushan's face, who else would it be?" Hong Xinjia was even more confused. With a blank expression, he asked, "Then if you offend Protector General Chu, won't you also be made to suffer in the future?" Chao Xiaojiao slowly drank a mouthful of wine. "Old Hong, don't worry about it. You wouldn't understand even if I told you. You're just fated to deal with dead things like dirt and rocks. Don't get mixed up in this mess." Hong Xinjia smiled. "No matter what, a promotion is a good thing." Chao Xiaojiao said in a muffled voice, "I, Chao Xiaojiao, will display my abilities according to how high an official I'm given. But if anyone wants me, I'm willing to give up my life. Don't even think about it. There's nothing in the world that's more valuable than life. I'm not an empty-handed little pawn that needs to use my life to fight for my future." Hong Xinjia was half flustered and half angry. "You should just keep these words to yourself and rot in your stomach." Chao Xiaojiao raised the curtain and gazed at the autumn wind sweeping up the yellow sand. Wave after wave, it swept across the desert. Hong Xinjia slapped his thigh and suddenly said, "I remember something. When I was drinking with old General, he accidentally let it slip. Do you still remember that day when the two battalions confronted each other and after the victor was decided, the prince gifted him a saber and a horse?" Chao Xiaojiao nodded and smiled. "It's just a little bit of skill to buy people's hearts." Hong Xinjia's expression was rather strange. He whispered, "The prince actually said something at the time." Chao Xiaojiao raised the wine pot and listened attentively. Hong Xinjia said, "It seems like the prince said, 'It's fine as long as you can accomplish something. I don't want you to throw your lives away.'" Chao Xiaojiao said nothing and drank a mouthful of wine. In the autumn wind, the two riders headed south. However, they did not return directly to the provincial capital of Liangzhou. Instead, they turned toward Yanji County of Yuzhou. In the evening of Bishan County, it suddenly began to rain heavily. Su Fengyan, who was drenched like a drowned rat, knocked on the door. He waited for a long time before the door opened. Looking at the woman's cold face, he smiled and said, "I'm hungry." The woman laughed coldly. "What a coincidence. I haven't eaten either." Su Fengyan slipped past the woman holding the umbrella. "I'll go." Yu Dilong would never be able to forget that scene for the rest of his life. At that time, the child only thought that this beautiful woman was either the empress or an expert more powerful than the 10 martial arts referees combined. Otherwise, it didn't make sense. It was also at that time that the flood dragon of the land felt that his master was still alive. Chapter 1151. In the autumn rain, Yu Dilong felt that his master was like a scoundrel who came to take advantage of him. The child didn't dare to enter the house. He squatted on the steps outside the threshold and looked up. Under the eaves, there was a black curtain of rain. The rain splashed on the ground and splashed on his trousers. Yu Dilong sighed softly. He suddenly missed his sister who carried a big wooden sword case. Hearing the sound of light footsteps, Yu Dilong turned around and saw the woman who he didn't know whether to call sister or aunt carry 2 small stools. She put one next to him and sat on the other. Yu Dilong hesitated for a moment but still sat on the stool. He sat upright and looked straight ahead. The widowed Pei Nanwei looked at the child's rigid sitting posture and asked softly, "What do you do?" Yu Dilong thought carefully and said shyly, "I'm my master's disciple." Pei Nanwei was amused. Could it be your master's master? Yu Dilong opened his mouth slightly and blushed. Pei Nanwei didn't say anything else. She looked at the mud in the yard with the child and said to herself, "We should have laid down stone slabs. The 10 kilograms of mud we dug from the swallow's nest ridge is gone." Yu Dilong listened to her nagging and didn't feel annoyed. Perhaps because he was an orphan since childhood, Yu Dilong felt a strange warmth. A voice came from behind them. Time to eat. At the small square table, Su Fengyan had already served the food and set the bowls and chopsticks. Pei Nanwei and Yu Dilong walked into the house with stools. Pei Nanwei and Su Fengyan sat opposite each other. The child thought for a moment and didn't dare to eat at the table. He just sat on the threshold with the bowl and continued to watch the rain hit the mud. At this moment, the child, who had been thinking about saving enough money to build a house since he could remember, decided that if he wanted to build a house in the future, he would build it according to this yard. "You still know to come back?" "Yes." "What did you do outside? Did you unify Jianghu, kill the Emperor of Liang, or flatten Beimang?" "Not really. But haven't you heard the news? What should a commoner hear? I went out and fought with Wang Xianji, and luckily survived. After that, he made a trip to the Eastern Sea's martial emperor city and took away all the weapons. On the way back to Beiliang, I met great-grandpa of the Wu family's sword tomb. After staying at Mount Qingliang for less than a day, I ran to the north of Liangzhou and finally sat here to eat with you." "How busy?" "It's just that I didn't earn enough money to bring it back." "Was the bag of rice that Zhu Zhengli carried here last time?" "You're eating so little, but I don't see you losing weight. It's time to grow fat again, so take it easy. If you're skinny, you can still wear old clothes, but it's just a little looser. If you're fat, you'll have to spend more money." "Pa!" A loud sound rang out. Yu Dilong quickly turned his head and saw her slamming her chopsticks on the table. "The Bishan County Yamen has already stopped your salary. I went to get it at the beginning of the month, but they refused to give it to me. He also said that you took a leave of absence for no reason and went to Mount Wudong to relax." When Yanji County's governor heard this, he was furious and seems to want to remove you from your position. "Go get it again and try again. Are you sure you won't make a wasted trip? If you can't get it, then forget it. My monthly salary is less than 10 taels of silver anyway." "Pa!" This time it was a slap to the bowl. Yu Dilong suddenly felt like laughing. After that, Su Fengyan washed the dishes. To Yu Dilong's surprise, his master didn't stay in this small county for long. After freeloading for a meal, he left in the rain. The woman didn't ask him to stay, but before they left the house, she took out a rain hat and a straw raincoat woven from bamboo leaves. She didn't give them to Yu Dilong's master, but gave them to the child and told him to put them on without any explanation. Yu Dilong timidly looked at his master. Su Fengyan dismissed it with a smile. The 2 horses' hooves trampled on the bluestone floor of the alley. Because it was a rainy night, the sound of the horses' hooves was muffled and didn't attract much attention. Although Yu Dilong's body was thin and weak, his bones were abnormally strong. Wearing the rain hat and the straw raincoat didn't seem heavy or cumbersome at all. It was just that they didn't fit him and looked really funny. Yu Dilong turned back to look at the courtyard. He didn't know why, but the child didn't rely on Beiliang Palace at all. He also didn't treat it as his home, but he felt close to this simple courtyard. He also had a strange thought in his heart that he couldn't tell anyone. It would be great if the woman was his mother. Yu Dilong gathered his courage and shouted, "Master!" Su Fengyan slowed down the horse and looked at the child with big eyes with slight confusion. Yu Dilong was quick-witted. He swallowed the words that were about to come out of his mouth and asked, "Where are we going?" Su Fengyan indifferently said, "Mount Wudong. I'm going to a paradise there to stabilize my body and spirit." Since Yu Dilong could see the strength of Wang Shang and Lu Yunchang's qi, he naturally knew a secret after spending so much time with his master. His master's qi had been declining. Simply put, his master's martial cultivation was like a bamboo basket that kept leaking water. If he didn't fix it quickly, there wouldn't be a drop left. It might even cause irreparable damage to the basket itself. This was also why Chu Lushan had asked for 500 cavalrymen to protect him at Huayang Pass. He had fought to the death with Wang Shenji, killed Zhao Huangchao, attacked Wu City, and fought against Wu Jian. Su Fengnian's strength was declining day by day at different stages. If it weren't for this, the great-grandpa of the Wu family's sword tomb wouldn't have taken the extra step of pretending to block Su Fengnian's way at the border of Yuzhou and River Province. Chapter 1152. Yu Dilong's face suddenly turned solemn. He turned his head and shouted, "Master!" Su Fengnian nodded and took the lead to stop the horse on this secluded muddy road. Yu Dilong's eyes widened as he saw the uninvited guest 100 feet away. It was a barefoot young woman in white. According to common sense, with the downpour, her clothes should be soaked, but her feet were a few feet above the ground. Her clothes fluttered, and there was a white rainbow behind her that formed a supreme, mysterious body of a bottle. In this way, the radiance she emitted was like a full moon that had descended to the human world. Yu Dilong suddenly felt like he was facing a great enemy. Although the woman's aura was not as fierce and frightening as that of the Bailiang cavalry commander, it was more profound and lasting. Su Fengnian stared expressionlessly at the qi cultivation genius of the Guanyin sect of the South Sea, who had picked up scraps along the way. First, she forcibly stole 100 swords on the lake of Yuan Mountain Villa. Later, she sat on the mountain and watched the tigers fight outside the Shenwu city. She probably wanted to fish in troubled waters, but she did not expect that Han Shengxian would suddenly die under the sword of Suaxia Valley. She did not succeed in absorbing his dissipated fate after his death and then disappeared. But after he defeated Wang Shenji, this woman began to absorb his constantly lost qi. In terms of the ability to grow fat, there was no glutton in the world who could compare with this woman who was nicknamed the Charcoal Girl. However, Su Fengnian had an agreement with the old woman of the Guanyin sect of the South Sea. The other party was polite, so Su Fengnian did not deliberately stop the woman's stealing action. Everyone in the world had their own bad karma and good karma. Su Fengnian also did not feel that he had to monopolize the fate of Jianghu. As long as he was not provoked, whether this strange woman who was born with a sword embryo like Wang Shang became a sword immortal and became the leader of the martial arts world, or whether Shenyuan Qingfeng was 1 foot tall and the devil was 10 feet tall, what did it have to do with him? After the Charcoal Girl obtained Su Fengnian's lost qi, she was like a fish in water. Compared to Yuan Mountain Villa, she was much more powerful. After she appeared, she looked at Su Fengnian. Her mouth curved into a condescending, playful smile. She stretched out her hand and waved it in front of her. It was like a beautiful painting scroll drawn by a celestial being. Under the Charcoal Girl's hands appeared one after another. There was the tall and sturdy old man Wang Shenji, who was riding the waves of the Eastern Sea. There was Deng Taiye, who was leading a donkey and holding a peach branch. There was the Western Chu official Chao Zhangqing, who was indecisive. There was Han Shengxian, who had red hair fluttering in the wind. There was a man holding a spear who looked somewhat similar to a green bird. There was Li Chungang, who was riding a sword with his hands behind his back. There were about 40 people in this long scroll, and all of them were great figures in Jianghu in the past 100 years. The people, dead people, of the people, dead. Those who were still shining brightly were those who were still alive in this world. Su Fengnian knew most of them. After the scroll was unfolded, he was ranked second. The third was Tuoba Bodhisattva. It was just that the positions of those who had passed away did not change, but the portraits of those who were still alive in the mortal world began to quietly change their positions. The most obvious change was undoubtedly that Tuoba Bodhisattva had squeezed out Su Fengnian's second place and became the second person on the left of the scroll. Among them, Huang Sanjia suddenly appeared on the list, showing an unknown scene. Moreover, the color of the spring and autumn demon was different from the black and white of the others. After the Charcoal Girl revealed this skill, she giggled and said, "This is the treasure of our Guanyin sect. Not only can it subdue demons and devils, it can also summon gods. Back then, my master, yes, the one who was defeated by Li Chungang, should have used this to shine in the spring and autumn period." Su Fengnian said calmly, "I know. It's the land pilgrimage painting." The Charcoal Girl said, "Wow, Su Fengnian, you've even heard of this?" Su Fengnian was silent. The charcoal girl of unknown origin smiled and pointed at the person on the top of the scroll with her slender finger. Su Fengyan, don't you want to know who this person is? Su Fengyan shook his head. The girl in white narrowed her eyes and said to herself, everything has its vanquisher. Back then, the nameless Taoist sealed the invincible Gao Shulu. The Taoist mansion of Longhu Mountain suppressed the devil Lu Songtao of Zhulu Mountain. Wang Xianji suppressed Li Chungang. In the end, you subdued Wang Xianji. Then, aren't you curious who's going to subdue you? Su Fengyan frowned. The charcoal girl was slightly surprised. She looked at a fresh portrait that appeared out of thin air in the scroll. She glanced at the earth dragon, then stared at Su Fengyan and continued, Su Fengyan, don't you want to know who Qi Xianzhu and Hong Shixiang, who are also the reincarnations of ancestor Lu, suppressed when they were born? Su Fengyan looked at the portrait at the top of the scroll. It was not the same as the other people. This person was blurry, but he was wearing a Confucian robe. He sat cross-legged and stared at a white water bowl in front of him. There was about half a bowl of water, and the water surface was slightly rippling. The charcoal girl who had been acting alone asked tirelessly, Su Fengyan, let me ask you, why is it that, in the past 100 years, the Confucian saint is the most difficult to be born? Shenyuan Jingqing reached this realm less than an hour ago. Huang Longsher is the same. Even Chao Chongqing is a dying man. Su Fengyan fell into deep thought. The charcoal girl who had not gotten a response all this time was like a woman who complained about her lover's lack of understanding. She stomped her feet and complained, Su Fengyan, will you die if you answer me? Su Fengyan could only sneer. An uncontrollable strong killing intent rose in his heart. Intuition told him that if he answered this woman, unless he was at his peak, he would really die. Chapter 1153. The charcoal girl looked at the young vassal king who had made up his mind to practice silent meditation. She did not give up and tried to goad him. Su Fengyan, you were once the most powerful warrior in the world. Why are you afraid of competing with a little girl? Su Fengyan stared at the Confucian scholar who had placed the bowl in front of him. He understood that the charcoal girl's words contained too many tricks. He could ignore half of the truth. This person was more likely to be the one who could restrain Huang Longsher. Otherwise, the devil Huang Sanjia would not have been so secretive and unwilling to enter the realm of terrestrial immortal. As for the one who really wanted to subdue him, it was most likely the charcoal girl herself. Nurturing qi, gathering fate, occupying fate, and finally achieving the grand qi phenomenon. Step by step. The charcoal girl's seniority in the Guanyin sect of the South Sea was even higher than that of the old woman. Moreover, she had a sword embryo. Her fate was not bad. Moreover, she had picked up the fate left by Su Fengyan. Could be said that she was blessed with fate. If she could get rid of Su Fengyan here and accept him completely, it was not impossible for her to become an unprecedented terrestrial deva. The Tide Listening Pavilion had collected countless rare copies of martial arts manuals. There were also many classified secret files that recorded the secrets of various sections. The Guanyin sect was the best place for qi cultivators in the south. However, the Tide Listening Pavilion still could not find any information about the chart of immortal pilgrimage. However, Li Chungang, who had personally beaten the charcoal girl's master back to the sea, had mentioned that the girl's martial arts were only outstanding but her swordsmanship was not top-notch. Even when facing him, she was not willing to use the trump card of a qi cultivator. Therefore, her journey in Jianghu was strange. She met many martial arts legends and young talents. She cast a wide net to catch more fish just to get familiar with them. She must have had an ulterior motive. When Su Fengyan first heard the charcoal girl's long-winded words, he did not pay much attention to what she said. He was more concerned about the reason why Dongtai drowned the Guanyin sect with his sword. However, when the charcoal girl called out his name for the second time, Su Fengyan immediately became alert. Since then, she had to mention the name Su Fengyan almost every time she spoke. This made Su Fengyan even more cautious. Moreover, because of Gao Shulu's mountain ceiling talisman, he thought of the world's talismans. Among them, there were immortal necromancers who often carried the Yan Shang Tu manual that was passed down from generation to generation when they traveled across mountains and rivers. They were familiar with the names of the immortals and ghosts in the world. If they met gods, they would worship them and obtain opportunities. If they met evil, they would kill them and accumulate good karma. Therefore, every time they met a mountain elf or a ghost, they would call it by its name and supplement it with incantations. Those with high cultivation could follow the teachings of their founding ancestors and recite the secret incantations that were originally hidden in the heavens. Immediately, they would trigger the Tianji purple thunder to kill it. The charcoal girl was about to speak when Su Fengyan took the initiative to speak for the first time. He asked, "Your actions are contrary to the original intention of your sect." On the lake of Yuan Mountain Heights, the old woman said that she would bring a large number of qi cultivators to the battlefield at the border of Beiliang. "If I die, you will lose your life-saving talisman. It is inevitable that there will be complications. Aren't you afraid of being caught by the sect?" The charcoal girl smiled wittily and said, "When a general is outside, he can't obey military orders." The charcoal girl clearly felt the killing intent of the man on horseback. She smiled and said innocently, "A good man doesn't fight with a woman. Moreover, you are the king of Beiliang. Don't lower yourself to my level. I will leave now. I will not dare to provoke you in the future. I will obediently stay on the isolated island in the South Sea. When you die, I will come back to the land." Su Fengyan bent down and stroked the horse's mane. The charcoal girl's face changed dramatically. She said anxiously, "Su Fengyan, can you be more magnanimous?" In the distance of more than 10 feet between the two, a still rain curtain condensed. It was visible to the naked eye. It was like a gate falling from the sky, constantly moving toward the charcoal girl. Su Fengyan gently clenched his fist. Although there was no rain curtain behind the charcoal girl, thousands of raindrops shot toward the girl's back. The charcoal girl drew an arc with 2 of her fingers. The character scroll circled around her in a circle. She stared at the man who was supposed to be mature but had lost his temperament. She said in fear, "Su Fengyan, you deliberately tricked me?" Countless soybean-sized raindrops hit the scroll rapidly. The rain curtain containing violent sword intent tilted and collapsed in front of the charcoal girl. Su Fengyan gently squeezed the horse's belly and slowly moved forward. This Beiliang A-class warhorse stepped on the path of the rain curtain and gradually moved to a higher place. It was high enough to overlook the charcoal girl who wanted to take advantage of the situation. Every time the horse's hooves stepped on the ground, the scroll around the charcoal girl trembled. Su Fengyan said calmly, "Everyone in the world has their own reasons to talk about, but some general principles are still the same." Yu Dilong muttered angrily, "Master's fate was taken by you, but your mother-in-law really has the heart to harm others." The charcoal girl who was trying her best to withstand the rain curtain and the raindrops hitting the bell said angrily, "If I don't take it, I will be punished. This is not given by you, Su Fengyan. It is given to me by God." As the master, Su Fengyan was expressionless. As the disciple, Yu Dilong, who was an outsider, was really annoyed to the extreme. He gritted his teeth. The child did not realize that his body was blooming with a majestic aura. It was neither Taoist's Gang Qi nor the Buddhist's Golden Rainbow. Chapter 1154. Muddle-headed Lu Long, who had suddenly sunk into a state of oblivion, stared at the magnificent picture scroll. His eyes blazed as he jumped off the horse. This child ran faster and more nimbly than a runaway wild horse. He even broke through the thick and heavy curtain of rain. Reaching out his arm, he grabbed Wang Xianji, who had a dark color on the picture scroll, and pulled her back. The charcoal girl was not enraged by this strange child's interference. Instead, she was pleasantly surprised. His intrusion was probably because Su Fengyan was worried that the child's body and mind would be hurt by the rain, so he relaxed his defense. As a result, the charcoal girl, who was trapped, had a slim chance of survival. However, just as she was about to use her mind to take the picture scroll back, she suddenly realized that the immortal atlas she had nurtured for many years had been easily snatched away by the child. The charcoal girl's vision turned black. She was so angry that she almost fainted. It was not easy for her to stand firm. When she opened her eyes, she saw that the picture scroll had been divided into 2. Most of it had been snatched away by the child, but the remaining figure was left in place. The man who had set up the bowl, Su Fengnian. Su Fengnian released his qi. The warhorse fell gently into the mud, safe and sound. He ordered Lu Long, "Put it away." Lu Long did not know how to put it away. With a thought, the person on the painting quickly overlapped. What he held in his hand was like a painting scroll. The girl was terrified and uneasy. She fell but first into the mud. Her face was snow-white. Adding on her white robes, she was like a female ghost wandering in the night. She kept muttering to herself, "How is this possible? How can it be like this?" Su Fengnian did not pay attention to this rude and arrogant young woman. Instead, he looked at the only remaining person. The person in the painting had one hand at the bottom of the bowl. He was still sitting, but his body slowly floated up and coincidentally met Su Fengnian's gaze. Su Fengnian asked, "Was it you who secretly instructed Zhao Huangchao to go to the Earth Lung Mountain to raise an evil dragon? Then you went with the flow to help Huang Longsher stir up the spring and autumn? In the end, you guarded Great Peace City. When the king of Jing fought for the throne, it was you who did not let Wang Shenji, the adoptive father of Zhao Heng, the old king of Jing, and go to the capital to support him. All those years of literature and martial arts reviews, most of them were written by you, right?" The man whose face was still blurry did not speak. Su Fengnian asked with a smile, "Heaven, earth, and man all have their own mathematical principles. Yuan Benshi has been the same for several decades. He should be keeping an eye on the connections for the Liang dynasty. Zhao Huangchao cultivated in seclusion, which created the terrain. In that case, you must be the leader of the Qi refinement warriors in the north. However, I am very puzzled. Back then, when Hong Shixiang destroyed the fate energy of the country, 2 streams of fate energy flowed into Beiliang and West Chu respectively. Why didn't you stop them?" The man finally opened his mouth to speak. The moment he opened his mouth, the world that was pouring with rain instantly fell silent. It's just a debate between heaven and man. I once defended the Zhao clan, who was blessed by the heavens. As for you, what do you say? Su Fengnian sneered and said, "Damn, you just like to be self-righteous and spout nonsense." The man asked in return, "Is that so?" Su Fengnian seemed to be unwilling to argue. The man laughed and said, "In the next 10 years, there will be 4 major battles. I only need to win one to win." After sitting and watching the clouds rise and fall for many years, the man finally stood up. His feet seemed to have landed in the mud of this small path. Su Fengnian saw that the man began to walk forward. Then, he brushed past him and headed towards Shishu. Su Fengnian stood where he was. The dragon was at a loss, while the charcoal girl's heart was like dead ashes. Su Fengnian raised his head and looked at the raindrops falling in the night sky. Every drop was crystal clear. The trend of the world today was no longer so unclear. Needless to say, Crown Prince Zhao Zhuan had an incomparable innate advantage and still occupied the most fate energy. Huang Sanjia and Beimang State Preceptor Yuan Qingshan chose Zhao Zhu at the same time. This person, who might be the true scholarly sage of the century, chose Chen Jibao. This was undoubtedly a situation that Su Fengnian was most unwilling to see. Su Fengnian turned to the charcoal girl and said, "Using external objects to steal the secrets of the heavens is not a long-term solution. If you are really interested in the martial arts world, I will make a deal with you." The charcoal girl's eyes lit up. "You want me to invite the Qi cultivators of the Guanyin sect to the border to promote the Beiliang?" Su Fengnian shook his head and said, "I want you to temporarily move the entire sect's manpower behind the defense line of the Jinkenjiang tomb. You are also allowed to withdraw from Beiliang if the situation is not good." The charcoal girl was stunned. "Are you crazy?" Su Fengnian shook his head and said, "It is the Beimang Empress who has gone crazy. Beiliang and I have no choice but to go crazy with her." The charcoal girl said with an aggrieved expression, "How can I dare to roam the martial arts world alone now? From here to the Southern Sea, I have to take a detour. It is thousands of miles away. Can you be at ease?" Su Fengnian glanced at her. The charcoal girl pouted and admitted defeat. I know. You just want to say that this is how you walked out of Beimang. But you're a man, and I'm just a weak woman. If I delay your important matters, I'll just die somewhere, Su Fengyan smiled and said, I will let the heavy sword cave's master, Mi Fengjie, protect you on your way back to the Guanyin sect. The charcoal girl asked for a yard after taking an inch. Is there anything more powerful? Su Fengyan asked, What do you think of me? The charcoal girl said excitedly, Good. Su Fengyan no longer paid attention to this muddle-headed fairy and continued to gallop forward on his horse. Yu Dilong followed closely behind, leaving her stomping her feet resentfully. In the rainy night, Yu Dilong suddenly called out, Master! Su Fengyan turned his head in confusion. The child grinned and scratched his head, probably because he suddenly did not know what to say. Su Fengyan smiled and said, Since you have recognized me as your master, then I will tell you something. In the future, if you see such high and mighty fairies roaming the martial arts world, beat them up until they run home crying. Yu Dilong nodded heavily, because of this unintentional conversation between master and disciple tonight. In the following 100 years, no one dared to call themselves fairies. Chapter 1155. Wenlong was born in Bailiang. Even if he did not hear any Jianghu rumors or anecdotes, but no matter how ignorant he was, he still heard that there were many immortals living on Mount Wudong. Each of them had the demeanor of an immortal and could summon the wind and rain. Therefore, when he followed his master to climb the mountain this time, he was especially pious. Every time he met a Taoist priest on the mountain, regardless of whether they were old or young, he would stop and salute them. This made the Wudong Taoists who recognized Su Fengyan very terrified. Su Fengyan did not stop the child from being serious. This pure heart of a child might be the cornerstone of Wenlong's courageous progress on the path of martial arts in the future. A newborn calf was not afraid of any tiger. If he was lucky enough to survive once, he would definitely not survive the tiger's mouth every time. When Su Fengyan was climbing the mountain, he whispered to Yu Dilong, If a person can be fearless in Jianghu, there are two kinds of people. The first kind is those who do not know the depth of Jianghu and are arrogant, or those who have some background and have something to rely on and look down on others. These people are as numerous as the hairs on a cow, and many of them die. The other kind is those who already know the dangers of Jianghu, whether it is their own understanding or the advice of their seniors, but they are stubborn and have a clear conscience. This kind of person is relatively rare, but the number of deaths is not small. Jianghu is such a place. It doesn't care whether you are good or bad. If you are not good in water or have bad luck, as long as you get involved, you will easily drown. In just a few years, most of the masters who died in my master's hands are the latter. Your junior apprentice sister Wang Shang studies the sword, and she will not change in this lifetime. Since ancient times, there have been battles of will and Taoism. The person who said it most thoroughly and saw it the most clearly, that person used to cultivate on this mountain. The reason why he did not let Wang Shang practice on the mountain was because he was afraid that it would be dark under the lamp, and she would not be able to see the mountain clearly. He simply let her go further away to look at the scenery. After all, her rise is very high. If she blindly spoils things through excessive enthusiasm, she may become an embroidered pillow like the Spring Invitation Cottage's sect master in the future. Your junior brother, Lu Yunchong, is extremely sharp, but he's also filled with bloodlust. Just by relying on joining the army at the border to kill people, his saber arts will only deteriorate as he kills. His martial path will become narrower and narrower. In the end, he will be caught in his own trap. Even if he has Gu Jiantong's talent, as long as he doesn't have Gu Jiantong's breadth of mind and vision, he will definitely not be able to master a top-grade saber art. That was why he was sent to the Fish Dragon Gang to train for a few years. The world was like a mirror, and the more you looked at someone, the more you wiped the mirror. Her heart was not his heart. You have to be an understanding person first, only then can you understand how to use a saber. A saber has a single edge, it's more focused on killing intent than a sword. It's extremely hard and easy to break. If you don't understand anything, sooner or later you'll die by your own saber. As for you, you're still young. You might as well learn from that guy called Hong Shixiang on the mountain. There's no need to rush, and there's no need to force yourself to take that step. I only have the three of you as my disciples. Lu Yunchong will fight for the limelight, so it won't be your turn as the eldest senior brother for the time being. He would gladly carry your burden on his shoulders. In this world, other than the crown prince who's destined to sit on the dragon throne in the future, no one has to be successful. As long as you can protect yourself, you can live however you want, as long as you're happy. Among the three of you, Wang Shang is a little different. Because she practices swordsmanship, out of selfishness, I put master's score on her and gave her a heavy burden. I have to make this clear to you. You can't hold a grudge against Wang Shang because of this. Walking behind Su Fengyan on the steps, Lu Long hurriedly waved his hand and said, Master, I won't. I can't wait for junior sister to practice the most powerful swordsmanship. It doesn't matter if she's better than me. Su Fengyan stopped and turned back to look at Lu Long. The child blushed slightly from being stared at. Su Fengyan joked, You have a good eye. Ignoring everything else, you've already inherited master's teachings on this point. This child's physique had been enlightened at an early age and had reached the consummation stage. He was miles ahead of his master, Su Fengyan. Now that his ignorant thoughts were exposed, he scratched his head and pretended to be stupid. Su Fengyan looked into the distance and said softly, If the three of you become successful in the future, you must remember two things. Wang Shang and Lu Yunzhang should have a life and death battle between swords and sabers. You don't have to stop them from competing, but I hope you won't kill Lu Yunzhang in a fit of anger. Also, don't learn from master's womanizing ways, but not his heartlessness. Smart people fall in love, but if they're unlucky enough to meet a bad person, they'll suffer a fate worse than death. Whether it's true or not, there's almost no one who's comfortable. Look at Chao Chongqing and Shenyuan Jingqing, and then look at the carefree Dong Tai. Su Fengyan stopped talking halfway. Yu Dilong heard half of it and waited for a long time, but he didn't continue. He looked up at his self-proclaimed heartless master. After Su Fengyan slowly came back to his senses, he rubbed Yu Dilong's head and asked with a smile, Do you think it's your master's wife? Yu Dilong stared blankly for a moment, but he quickly said decisively, Pei Nan Wei. Su Fengyan bent his finger and tapped the child's forehead. It's not bad to help those close to you, but those who achieve great things are mostly neutral and peaceful. Master has suffered a lot in the past, so you have to learn from it. Yu Dilong sighed, his entire face scrunched up. He complained, Master, you've said so many great principles today. I can't eat them all at once. Su Fengyan smiled and said that eating was a blessing, but he really didn't talk to his disciple anymore. The two of them silently climbed up the mountain. Under the secret instruction of Mount Qingliang, the local government donated several large sums of money to Mount Wudong. They also contributed a lot of manpower to help build a new Black Tortoise Hall, Guanxinggu, Law Enforcement Bureau, and a series of other grand and elaborate buildings on the mountain. Furthermore, they also built an academy on the mountainside, a place with picturesque hills and limpid waters, where the immortal music of Taoist school was faintly discernible, intertwined with the sound of books, bringing out the best in each other. Some of the old and dilapidated buildings on Mount Wudong that couldn't be repaired were also given a new look. The incense on the mountain was already flourishing, and with the new Prince Liang's undisguised support, the pilgrims were ordinary people. It was impossible to tell whether or not Mount Wudong's celestial aura had increased, but the human and fiery aura was much more than before. Every 1st and 15th day of the month, there were many tourists, and the incense was flourishing. Could almost compete with Mount Longhu. After Su Fengyan met the old Jinren Chen Yao, who was in charge of discipline, he settled down next to the elephant washing pond where he used to practice his saber. He didn't deliberately restrain the little dragon, allowing the child to wander around the mountain. Su Fengyan spent most of his time meditating on a huge rock in the middle of the pond. Finally, he stopped the qi in his body from collapsing for 1,000 li. The water level of the pond slowly rose back up. During this period of time, there was a constant stream of courier riders delivering redacted copies of the relatively important Wutongan documents to the mountain. In his spare time to stabilize his body, Su Fengyan would carefully read through each official document. Other than the courier riders delivering important government affairs, secret military affairs at the border were handed over to the experienced spies of the Fu Shui Bureau. Among the spies were some newly recruited Jianghu experts, all of whom had already been selected by Chu Lushan. It was unrealistic to have these people fight to the death on the battlefield, but to have them do some relaxing work, they would still be scrambling for it. Selecting Jianghu people to be elite courier soldiers was one of the suggestions put forward by Wang Lifting, who had taken over the Golden Weaving Bureau from Li Shifeng. Apart from this, the Golden Weaving Bureau set up weaving departments in the other 3 prefectures. They could not personally participate in local governance, arresting thieves, or participating in impeachment, but they could help Mount Qingliang secretly report and supervise various affairs. At the same time, it was precisely because of Wang Lifting's suggestion that the total of more than 20 academies in Liangling and Yuzhou, under the leadership of 3 leaders of the literary scene, evaluate 3 best articles of any genre each month. The winner would directly obtain an official position in Beiliang. There was something interesting about this. The literary giant in Liangzhou responsible for reviewing the articles was none other than Wang Chudong, who had written The First Snow. However, the articles that truly reached Su Fengyan's hands were mostly those abandoned articles that criticized the current political situation. Although many of the articles were biased in their point of view, even treacherous and heinous, these scholars had quietly put their names on Wutangen's archives. Even they themselves did not know that many of the resentful works that they had tossed into the wastepaper basket, those crumpled manuscripts, would appear on Mount Qingliang's study desk several days later. Su Fengyan's temporary thatched hut was practically lit at night. On a stormy, thunderous night, Su Fengyan finished reading all the reports from Beiliang's spies and the reports from Liang's residents that had been delivered to him. He picked out 3 and spread them out on the table. One came from Huayang Pass, where the border protectorate was located. It was personally written by Chu Lushan. It was said that one's handwriting was like one's person, but Chu Lushan's handwriting was extremely delicate and gentle, practically the handwriting of a woman. It was truly impossible to associate it with his bloated body. The secret letter reported the general progress of the refugees in Liuzhou. After Beiliang relaxed its border restrictions, the number of refugees entering the country had reached a peak. In a single month, the number of people crossing the border had reached 4,000. However, those who chose to enter Beiliang's army were few and far between, almost negligible. Only when the news that Su Fengyan, the king of Beiliang, had killed Wang Xianji spread out, and the newly appointed governor of Liuzhou, Yang Guangdou, added fuel to the fire. Finally, there was a large wave of people. In the short span of 10 days, 6,000 people had taken the initiative to request to join the army at the border. Chapter 1156. Although the spring and autumn period had been a long time ago, proving that there were no long-lived generals who could fight against 10,000 men, but an army with 10,000 men as its backbone was completely different. Su Fengyan, Chu Lushan, Yuan Zuozong, and the others did not think that the valiant refugees could form an army of their own in Liuzhou. They did not believe that they could defend against the charge of Beimang's cavalry. With hundreds of thousands of refugees, it was true that everyone could mount a horse and fight. However, in a mature army, even after 10 to 20% of casualties, the army's morale would still be intact. These refugees seemed to have a large number, but in a real battle, not only would they not be able to withstand a single blow, they might even break up Beiliang's original formation. Therefore, the best situation was to scatter these refugees and send them to the border army. Then, a portion of Beiliang's elites would be transferred to Liuzhou. They would be the cornerstone of Liuzhou's defense against Beimang's cavalry. However, this kind of thing could not be forced. Although the refugees did not have to worry about food and clothing after joining the army, it was still a job where one's head was tied to one's belt. No one was stupid. A bad life was better than a good death. Su Fengyan mocked himself. The title of number 1 in the world is still very useful. The secret letter also mentioned the conflicts between the refugees and the old soldiers after joining the army. There were even people who could not bear the humiliation and killed people in anger, almost causing a mutiny. In the letter, Chu Lushan said that as long as the refugees were involved, they would be executed. Su Fengyan sighed. Although the refugees who survived the pile of corpses were fierce and brave, they did not dare to cause trouble in Beiliang's army. Naturally, it was the old soldiers who looked down on the refugees first. It could be said that the deaths of these refugees were extremely wronged. However, Su Fengyan did not want to change Chu Lushan's decision. Without rules, nothing could be accomplished. In the army camp, the old soldiers bullied the new soldiers. This was a bad habit that no leader could get rid of. If the old soldiers at the border bullied the new soldiers, they would be punished. However, if the new soldiers broke the rules, they would be killed. If the refugees wanted to stand out, they only had one chance, and that was to fight in the battlefield and win the respect of the old soldiers. They had to treat them as brothers and comrades. There was no other path for them to take. The second letter came from Wuxia. Liang carried out a large-scale extermination of Buddhism, so the number of displaced monks entering the country was as numerous as the carps crossing the river. It was inevitable that both mud and sand would sink together. Naturally, not everyone was an eminent monk who was wholeheartedly devoted to Buddhism and did not stir up dust. The reason why they cultivated Buddhism was because they had not yet become Buddha. Among them, there were many famous monks who were used to living like princes. They used various channels to ask the government for the tax-exempt land granted by the temple. Nominally, they were praying for Su Fengyan, the prince of northern Liang's temple. There was a dispute in Wuxia because of this. Su Weisheng's opinion was that not only should they not open this mouth, they should also order the local government to severely reprimand these monks and expel them. Lu Qingyan's opinion was to appease them on the surface but secretly keep an eye on them. If they did not agree, they could just drag it out. There was no need to fall out with them. Su Fengyan rubbed his temples and smiled bitterly. One is ruthless, the other is kind. Both seem to be right. Let's just pretend we didn't see this. The third letter was very interesting. Came from Liang. There were many twists and turns in the process. In the end, they were able to enter Beiliang. Other than the fact that money could make ghosts drag the mill, they also had a lot of luck. Between Guangling Road and Nanjing was Lake Yanjiao. It was a man-made lake after Liang unified the world. It was said that it was used to suppress the dragon aura left behind by West Chu. There was an island in the lake. On the island, there was a warehouse that was heavily guarded. The warehouse was specially stored in a yellow book that was produced every 5 years by the various provinces of the dynasty. It recorded the household registration, farming, and labor situation of the various regions of Liang. But the world did not know that other than the yellow book of the head of the Ministry of Revenue in the capital, there was an even more obscure file. Other than the current Grand Secretary, not to mention the various government offices, even the 2 chief officials of the Hall of Governmental Affairs could not read it. That was the Book of the Various Armies. This originated from when the late emperor ordered the compilation of the duties of various ministries. Not only did he have to specify the exact amount of farmland in the world, he also had to protect military secrets. As a result, he made a compromise and hung the Yellow Book of Farming under the various ministries and provinces. Guangling Road was originally the granary of the world and could be considered hidden. However, the number of farmland in both Liao and Liao was surprisingly large. There was no doubt that this was the reason for hanging up the Yellow Book. The current Right Assistant Minister of the Ministry of War, Lu Mao, had asked the Marquis Gongliang, who was in charge of Lake Yanjiao, for a list of names. This imperial relative impeached him according to the rules. Lu Mao, who was slow to realize this, successively submitted a letter of apology. However, he was still unable to keep his position as Right Assistant Minister. He was demoted to Yanqi Road, a wild and desolate place where miasma overflowed. In the end, he died of old age in his post. This time, because of the influence of West Chu's revival, Lake Yanjiao began to move north on a large scale. During this time, there was not a single original copy of the book, but for no reason, there were many copies of the program. Most of them flowed into Guangling Road, while a small number were scattered among the common people. The Beiliang spies planted in the territory half-bought and half-robbed from a group of Jianghu people and obtained a cup of soup. The numbers on the Yellow Book were dead, but those who were observant could see that many things were alive.